The most daring idea in Indonesian archaeology may be sleeping under the Java Sea, where a drowned staircase of stone could be the seaward extension of Gunung Padang, perhaps even the buried bones of a pyramid waiting to breathe again in the dim light of a diver's lamp. Tonight, we descend not only into water but into time, listening for the quiet evidence of a world that rose and fell with the tides of ice and fire, and asking a simple question with enormous consequences: if an ancient complex truly extends from the terraced hill of West Java into the continental shelf below, what would it mean for the story of human beginnings in the tropics? And why has the argument over its age and authenticity grown so strangely loud and strangely hushed at the same time? The sea at night is a patient archivist, its surface calm and steady as ink while its currents file away particles of memory along the seafloor. A red navigation light blinks somewhere to the east, and beyond it, the traffic lanes of the Sunda Strait whisper their constant lullaby of engines and foam. But beneath us, past the last curling feather of phosphorescence, there is a darker landscape, a mosaic of sand ripples and limestone shelves and reefs, broken here and there by angular shadows that do not seem to drift, that do not seem to fold into the natural pattern of waves and grain, that instead hold their lines like a held breath. A camera descends on a slow tether. A green monitor hums in the cabin. We watch light become distance, and distance become the suggestion of form. In West Java, on a hill named Gunung Padang, columns of basalt lie in terraces like a staircase built for giants, each block a prism cooled from volcanic fire and then rearranged, some say by nature's fractures and gravity, some say by human hands, into platforms facing the sun. It is a place of wind and lichen and rumor, where the geometry of stone and the geometry of belief have braided themselves together for generations. Visitors feel the steps beneath their shoes and ask the same questions we are asking now at sea: who cut this path, who climbed it, and when did they begin their ascent? The debate is more than archaeological. It is a test of what counts as evidence and how we decide a narrative is ready to be told. A claim has been made, bold enough to bend even the most drowsy attention awake. It says that the heart of this structure may be far older than the usual timelines of human construction in Indonesia, that deep layers beneath the visible terraces could belong to a design set in place more than 20,000 years ago, a time when the last great ice sheet still held the oceans in suspension and the Sunda Shelf, now drowned, was a wide lowland of rivers and marshes and coasts. This claim is stitched to cores of earth drilled from the hill, to dates of charcoal and sediments, to geophysical scans that seem to trace hidden shapes underneath the soil. It is also stitched to counter-arguments that are measured and careful and necessary, to warnings that charcoal migrates, that old carbon can be trapped in younger layers, that nature writes right angles into rock when it cools and breaks, that our eyes make patterns out of coincidence in the dim light because stories are what they crave the most. It is no insult to imagination to say that this is the correct fight to have. When someone whispers 20,000 years, that whisper touches every part of the toolkit of science, because fusing numbers to stones is one of the hardest crafts we have invented. Radiocarbon dates attach to the life that was burned or buried, not always to the masonry that surrounds it. Layers buckle and slip and drink the rain in ways that carry particles downward and upward again. Stone columns, especially basalt, love to arrange themselves into tidy prisms when they cool, a cosmic filing system that gives us cliffs of hexagons and ridgelines of steps with no mason in sight. The ethical duty of wonder is to proceed as slowly as the tide, to lay down marks that can be returned to by anyone with sober hands, and to demand that the evidence stands up to the gentle but relentless test of replication. But let us not forget geography's quiet revolution. At the end of the last glacial maximum, sea level stood roughly 100 meters lower than they do today, and the map of Southeast Asia would have looked different enough to be uncanny to our modern eyes. What we call the Sunda Shelf shallow waters wrapping Indonesia's western islands and the Malay Peninsula was a vast lowland with braided rivers and open plains, a landscape where people walked and camped and perhaps built things that made the land feel like a memory. When the ice melted and the oceans advanced, valley by valley, inlet by inlet, they did what oceans always do. They kept their own counsel and covered what lay before them. If there were platforms and walls and quarries in those drowned places, the sea preserved them not like a museum, but like a sleep, drawn over by silt and the slow breathing of currents into something that can be found but not easily claimed. We are not the first to suspect that civilization may have left footprints in flooded rooms. Off the coast of India, divers have traced lines of dressed stone near ancient river mouths. Near Japan's Yonaguni, arguments flourish around steps and ledges that might be temples or might be tectonics. In the Bay of Naples, villas lie quietly in the volcanic cradle where emperors once watched the water drape itself in silk. Each of these places teaches the same paradox that rules the seabed. Underwater, geometry lasts because life is thinner there, and at the same time, pattern fools us because familiarity is sparse and we want to read messages where there are only echoes. Our task as we drift above the Java Sea is to listen to those echoes, to place microphones on the silence and then replay the tape at half speed until the signal separates from the static. Imagine a line running from Gunung Padang's terraces westward, then bending south, then dissolving into the shelf. Not a straight line of iron decree, but a geological corridor, a ridge and a series of knuckles where volcanic memories harden into stone and then fracture. If someone once used that ridge, if they built upon it and rose it by hand the way coral rises by instinct, then out here, beyond the reach of the morning temple shadows, we might find an architecture that has been worn smooth but not erased. We might find steps that are too even for a storm to have made, walls that face each other with a stubborn parallelism, courtyards whose floors know the level of human feet. Or, more humbling and more likely, we might find the sublime precision of cooling lava pretending to be a design, a kind of natural minimalism composed of hexagons and planes and regular joints, as if nature herself were the first engineer and we are merely her small apprentices on the surface boats with our anxious instruments and our sleepless eyes. The underwater burial hypothesis is older than this coastline. Java is a ledger of eruptions and rains. Mudflows called lahars have poured down its volcanoes in curtains thick enough to carry trees and boulders to the sea, and ash has fallen in blankets so dense that a hillside can awaken after a storm and find itself rearranged. If a structure were begun and then smothered, if terraces were carved and then locked in by volcanic skin only to be surrendered later to the rising tide, the signatures would be complex but legible. There would be differences in compaction and grain, layers of ash that are not quite soil and yet admit roots, bands of charcoal and silt and stone that speak the rhythm of flood and fire. There would be edges more crisp than a dune and more stubborn than a reef, and between those edges a language of abrasion that a geologist can read like a prayer book. On our screens, the sonar paints in sweeps. First there is an oblique ray that touches nothing. Then, gradually, the light returns as scattered dots, and then as lines. The seafloor appears like a blind drawing by a patient hand. A flank rises, a shelf interrupts the field, and beyond it a narrow trench runs like a careful incision. Side scan returns accumulate into tapestries. The ship turns. The image sharpens. Nothing jumps out with fanfare. But small things hold their shape through the rotation. A corner holds its 90 degrees a little too long. A flat plane refuses to crumble into ripples. An elongated mound ends with a clean cut where erosion should have made a tail. We place waypoints on these minor stubbornnesses, not because they prove anything in themselves, but because a map is made of such hesitations, and an argument should be built from patience rather than epiphany. Some will ask why this hunt matters at all, and the answer is easier to feel than to say. If people were building terraces on this ridge 20,000 years ago, that would not overturn physics or rewrite the genetic threads of migration, but it would widen the room in which we tell the story of skill and community in the tropics. It would suggest that architecture is not an invention that appeared in only a few river valleys and then radiated outward as a single flame, but something that can spark in many hearths where stone and time and intention coincide. It would also caution us about the fragility of evidence. So much can be erased by a century of rain, a month of ash, an hour of tide. If the first stairway was scratched onto a ridge that later became an island and later became a seafloor, then our only obligation is to admit how small we are before those scales and how careful we must be before we pronounce. The stormier part of this mystery has nothing to do with weather. It has to do with the social climate around unusual claims. Words like suppression get attached to controversies faster than barnacles to a hull, and soon the conversation is no longer about data but about motives, about who controls access to caves and cores and grants and journals. Here, in the quiet of a cabin vibrating softly with the thrum of a diesel engine, we can hold two truths at once. The first truth is that science is not a single voice but a choir, and the choir has rules that keep it in tune: show your data, show your methods, accept correction, welcome replication, and do not confuse a striking image with a strong conclusion. The second truth is that institutions have rhythms and resistances like any human arrangement, and sometimes bold ideas do not find easy doors to walk through. To move forward, a claim must survive both the tests of method and the tests of culture, and the way to pass both is the same. You light the path for others to check your steps. This is why the sea feels so honest. It does not care for titles. It cares for signals and for the absence of them. On the deck there is a roll chart, and on the chart a rectangle quietly penciled where anomalies seem to cluster. The crew will not sleep early. The divers will check their lines and backups and then sit in silence until the nod. When the water takes them, they will fall in slow columns of silver, bubbles cycling upward, hearts slowing by habit. The floodlight will open like a flower. The bottom will rise, and with it the first edges. If we are lucky, we will see straight lines that stay straight when we change our angle and our altitude. If we are fair, we will test those lines with hands and lenses, looking for joints and bedding planes, looking for chisel marks or the mimicry of fractures. If we are gentle, we will come away with samples not as trophies but as letters sealed for a later reading by labs that have no stake in romance. Somewhere in this, there is a fisherman whose grandfather told him about stones beneath the tide. He drew a line with his finger in the air from the hill inland to a place where the sea's color changes on clear mornings, and he said that in storms the waves talk as if they are striking steps. Such stories are not proof, and yet they are the reason we look at all. Oral maps linger where paper cannot, and memory holds shapes beyond measurements. When we match those maps to our grids, we are not agreeing with folklore against physics. We are asking if the world is kind enough to put the two in the same place once, just once, long enough for a camera to see and a hand to touch. The imagination wants pyramids because pyramids are what gravity and ambition do to stone and time. They are the settled answer to a simple problem: how do you make height that lasts in a world that is always returning everything to the ground? If the Java Sea holds one, even only a skeleton of one, it would join a global habit of rising and staying. But the more faithful hypothesis is quieter and no less beautiful. Nature's basalt can be an honest architect, and repeated joints can fool the eye into reading an altar where there is only a cooling pattern, a wall where there is only fracture control in a flow that hardened while the air was still thinking about rivers. The ethical task is to prefer an ordinary miracle over an extraordinary mistake. If we finally kneel on a ledge and brush away sand and uncover mortar and alignment and tool marks, that is the right place for the extraordinary to enter. Until then, the ordinary is enough, because it is truthful. You can feel the continental shelf in the way the waves move. Long-period swells lean and flatten as they cross the threshold from deep to shallow, and their energy spreads like a sigh. Below, sand grains creep inch by inch, then rest in patches where the current loses interest. Coral colonizes any edge that remains still long enough to be a conversation. A wall becomes a reef, and a reef becomes a confusion of life that hides the outlines we crave. In that clutter, light is not generous. It scatters, it dims, it refuses to pass without taking a fee. A documentary must learn a different grammar here. The words slow down into spaces. The images ask us to pause. This is not a chase scene. This is a watch. What we can promise is a method and a mood. The method is simple to say and complex to do. Map the bottom with multibeam sweeps until the relief becomes a coherent shape. Trace the anomalies with side scan until you can draw them by memory. Scratch the seafloor with a sub-bottom profiler to see if there are layers hiding beneath the first impression. Put a camera near the anomalies when the tide is slack and the visibility kind. Touch the stone. Smell the silt. Take cores where the story turns and send them to labs where names do not matter. Invite eyes that do not share our hopes to read the same screens and see if they nod or laugh. The mood is what you hear right now, the low drone of the hull and the hush of water. In that mood, the question can sit without demanding an answer before morning. Some will ask about the numbers again, and they are right to ask. If the hill is older, how much older? If the shelf holds an extension, when was it built and when was it drowned? If a volcano buried a level surface, where are the contacts and the flow directions? These questions are not challenges thrown across a table. They are the table itself. Dates can be tied to surfaces and to events. A sand lens trapped beneath an ash layer has a clock in its grains. A coral that grew over a wall has a signature in its skeleton. An abrasion on a stone face has a polish that belongs to a tide or to a storm. The beauty of timekeeping is that it does not care how impatient we are. It insists that patience is not a virtue here. It is a measuring device. In the dry rooms on land, this debate grows hot, which is odd because the subject is so cool and wet. Articles appear, and some are corrected, and some are withdrawn, and some are trumpeted in ways that make even sympathetic readers wince. The best habit we can keep is a refusal to make enemies out of colleagues, and a refusal to make celebrities out of stones. If the data are good, they will survive a scolding. If the data are weak, they will evaporate beneath their own glamour. If there is suppression, it will reveal itself not in whispers but in absent datasets and closed doors. If there is simply careful skepticism, it will look like long emails and requested clarifications and years of quiet, dull work handled by people whose names few will know. Let us bless the dull work for what it is, a path we must walk to earn the right to tell a thrilling story. The boat rolls, and the beam stutters in the water like a heartbeat. A school of fish wheels past in a silver parenthesis. Somewhere to the south, a thunderhead stalks the horizon, its underside flashing soundless light. The operator marks another contact. The cursor hovers and drops a point. The grid becomes a little denser. There is comfort in this, in the way the unknown becomes a pattern of flagged places and revisited shapes. If the sea does not give us a pyramid, it will still have given us the discipline to ask for one properly and the humility to accept a shelf of beautiful geology instead. And if, sometime before dawn, when we have lined up the camera and focused on the shadow of a corner, and the dust clears, and the edge refuses to shrug back into chaos, and a surface bears the crosshatch of tools and the faint step of a join that has no natural excuse, we will not celebrate first. We will measure first. We will not declare. We will document. We will not leap to a number. We will assemble the paths by which a number would be earned. The difference between a real discovery and a good story is that the real one cares very much about being tested by strangers in the morning. For now, you can rest with this thought. The Sunder Shelf once held fields and forests where ships now pass. The rivers that braided across it were cartographers long before we were. If there were gatherings, if there were platforms, if there were stones aligned to moment and season, the ocean would have covered them with a hand not of malice but of law. What law hides, it can also preserve. What the tide erases, it often writes again in fainter ink elsewhere. We are following the palimpsest. We are tracing the ghost of a staircase with instruments that translate pressure and time into lines on a green screen. When the morning comes, this opening will feel like a prologue to a different genre, one where the light is harsh and the water is milky and the diver's hands are cold. But in the dark, we can hear the shape of the question more clearly. Did a human plan extend from the hill to the shelf? Did a volcano lay a blanket that stilled a living place and kept it in a kind of suspended animation until the sea claimed it? Did the last ice age draw a coastline across a terrace that now lies beneath a school of anchovies? And in the present, as we argue with care and with ego, are we brave enough to separate the hunger for marvel from the responsibility to be exact? You are listening to Current and to Caution. We will go to the coordinates. We will follow the plan. We will invite the doubt onto the deck and give it tea and a warm seat. We will ask the claims to survive our company. 20,000 years is a number with gravity, but it is not a prophecy. It will either be earned or it will return to the drawer where most large numbers sleep. Meanwhile, the waves keep their schedule, and the moon lifts the tide by millimeters, and the map draws itself like a slow heartbeat across the screen in front of us. This is where a story about pyramids becomes a story about patience. It is also where a sleep documentary becomes, quietly, a documentary about the ethics of attention. The Java Sea is asking for neither belief nor disbelief, only for presence. When the lens finds the stone and the light is right, we will let the image hold itself still for longer than television is supposed to allow. We will breathe with the divers. We will let you see the edge and make your own first reading before we tell you ours. And then, gently, we will explain why edges can be liars and why, sometimes, they tell the truth, and how you can tell the difference if you give them enough time to reveal their habits. For now, let the hull hum be a metronome, and the soft, damp air be the curtain. Between Gunung Padang and the sea there is a corridor of possibility. Between ancient claims and modern instruments there is a bridge of method. Between the pressure to announce and the discipline to verify there is a narrow passage that we must navigate at low speed. We will take you through it, one careful frame at a time. If a pyramid is down there, it is patient. If it is not, the stones are patient anyway, and they will teach us another lesson about how the earth arranges itself when no one is watching. The argument began in the first sentence and it will keep company with us to the last. Something extends from the hill to the sea, whether it is a ridge nature broke into steps, or a set of platforms placed by people who understood weight and water before history bothered to remember their names. We will treat both possibilities with the same tenderness. We will hold them under the same light. And if in the end we must say, with a quiet voice, that the Java Sea holds only geology, we will say it with gratitude for the chance to have asked the sea a question at all. If instead we must say, with the same quiet voice, that hands once worked here and left their order behind beneath the fish and the tides, we will say that too. The sea does not mind either answer. It only minds noise. Tonight, we choose to listen. Listening begins with a map, and the most honest map of this story is drawn not with borders but with contours, a pale green plate called the Sunda Shelf spreading from the Malay Peninsula past Sumatra and Java to Borneo, its shadings telling a simple and radical truth: most of this water is shallow enough to have been land when the last ice age held the seas down like a steady hand on a drum. In the late Pleistocene, when glacier towered over higher latitudes and the planet's reservoirs of frozen water were swollen, sea level stood roughly 100 meters lower than today, and the Java Sea did not exist as a sea in the way it does now but as a low, broad country of rivers, lakes, swamps, and airy coasts facing a distant edge. The idea that architecture might sleep here, drowned yet intact, is impossible to entertain without first standing inside that vanished landscape and feeling how normal it would have been to walk where now the trawlers draw their nets in arcs of silver. Imagine a morning on that plain. The sun rises behind a belt of volcanoes to the south, the arc that is now Java's spine throwing long shadows across a network of braided channels. Those channels gather from uplands and spread like roots, cutting levees, splitting and rejoining, building islands of silt and starts of marsh where reeds lean with the wind. Farther north, the land wanes into a sequence of dunes and shelf ridges that only hint at the ocean, because the ocean is still a horizon away. Herds cross in dust. People leave footprints that fill with rain and then dry and crack. When storms arrive, the rivers surge and pour their suspensions across the flats, laying down layers that will later read like a book to those who have learned the letters of grain and color. In this kind of place, the idea of building terraces on a ridge or platforming a knuckle of rock is not exotic. The materials are at hand, the relief is gentle, the path is clear, and the seasonal cycles carve predictability into the calendar. The equilibrium that kept this lowland open was never at peace. The Arc's volcanoes fed it sediment as constantly as the ice fed it water from the other side of the world. When the climate shifted and the ice sheets began to relax, sea level rose in pulses and lulls, a stepwise serenade that lifted shorelines and moved the frontier inland river by river. Meltwater Pulse 1A, a surge in the Pleistocene's final act, added meters to the ocean in just a few centuries, and later pulses refined the shoreline further, trimming headlands, drowning valleys, scouring the shallow apron with transgressing waves that ground and lifted and ground again. What had been a floodplain became an estuary, what had been an estuary became an embayment, and what had been an embayment became the Java Sea as it is now, a shallow basin with an average depth that often barely exceeds a few dozens of meters, a kind of inland sea perched on a continental shelf. On a bathymetric chart, drowned rivers are still there, written as inverted ridges, pale lines incised into the seafloor that branch and rejoin like nervous systems. These paleochannels tell where freshwater once ran, and their junctions tell where floodplains once spread. Between them are shoulders and benches, not quite hills, but remnants of higher ground where floodwaters slowed and dropped their loads, or where older, harder rocks withstood the abrasion of the transgression. These are the ledges and steps that matter to the story, because hard points endure in soft landscapes, and if a terrace or wall or platform was placed where hard stone already held a margin, its chances of surviving a slow drowning improve with each extra centimeter of strength. This drowned shelf is not only a record of water, it is the front yard of a volcanic archipelago. South of Java, the Indian-Australian plate disappears beneath the Sunda plate along a trench that draws a clean curve on deep maps and writes a crooked line of mountains and cones on the surface. The rocks that rise from this marriage of plates are often volcanic basalt, andesite, and their cousins hard, dense, and fond of regular fractures. When flows cool, they shrink and crack in ordered ways, forming columns and joints that give the illusion of intentional design, hexagonal bundles standing like organ pipes, plates stacked like steps. This is the honest trickster of the region, the one natural habit that can lure eyes into reading architecture where there may be only geometry produced by cooling and stress. Any case for intention on this shelf must therefore separate the products of cooling and gravity from the products of planning and labor, a separation that sounds simpler than it is when every angle is softened by time and every surface is furred by life. Life is thinner under water than on land, but it is not absent. On any stone that remains still long enough, corals and sponges and bryozoans will build, and algae will gloss the edges with a patina of green that steals contrast and invites misreadings. The same currents that carry larvae also carry sand, and sand abrades and rounds even the proudest corners. Storm waves, especially in shallow basins, compress with fists strong enough to shake boulders into new positions and pile rubble against ledges in ways that mimic deliberate courses. The longer a feature sits in the surf zone as the sea transgresses, the more it is smoothed and rearranged by that belt of energy, a band of reworking called the ravinement zone that migrates landward with the rising sea like a wide eraser shaped by waves. For a structure to survive with its signature intact, luck and burial must cooperate, burial by fast-growing reefs, by sudden silt from flood or laha, by a landslide that seals the face away from surf until it lies beyond the reach of waves in water deep enough to quiet the heavy motions. Volcanic burial offers that kind of seal in a way other processes rarely do. A laha, those dense, chocolate rivers of ash and rock and water can flow like wet cement down a volcano's apron and into lowlands, filling hollows, draping slopes, and setting into a weak concrete that later ages into hardpan. If a terrace or platform lay in that path, the laha would bury it in a single episode, preserving edges and alignments beneath a mass that resists immediate reworking. Ash falls to the same without movement, beating down leaves, flattening roofs, and creating layers that first choke and then protect. In the arc that built Java, such episodes were not rare. Even if none matched the far-off violence of the Toba eruption on Sumatra, which threw ash across half a continent in a Pleistocene instant, the local rhythms of eruption, mudflow, and flood were enough to write this landscape in alternating bands of gentle accretion and abrupt event. Beneath the surface, time rearranges the evidence with a slower craft. In sheltered bays and drowned valleys, fine sediments settle in laminations that look like pages laid atop one another. Each layer records the mood of its season, coarser in stormy years, finer in quiet ones, more organic when mangroves expand at the shoreline, more mineral when burned scars wash hillside soil into the sea. Mangrove peats, those dark, fibrous beds built of roots and leaves and time, can form thick tongues along ancient coasts and then drown in place, preserving a price list of sea level rise that can be read by radiocarbon. Sands on open shelves, bleached and reorganized by waves, can reveal how long they sat in daylight before burial through luminescence techniques that measure when grains last felt the heat and light of the sun. Corals that grow on old stone faces capture in their skeletons the age of the moment they colonized a surface, a date that says not when the wall was made, but when the sea allowed life to take hold there, a terminus that anchors our speculations with restraint. All these clocks and charts matter because they draw a corridor of plausibility on the seafloor where the search can be honest and efficient. Not every depth is equal. In a basin like the Java Sea, the band between 20 and 60 meters becomes especially interesting, shallow enough that a structure built on land could have crossed it during the transgression while retaining some of its form, deep enough that the ceiling of the storm's reach in later centuries would not have battered it to a formless memory. Above 20 meters, surf and surge spend too much time combing and grinding. Below 60 meters, the land had been sea for so long, even at low stand, that the chance of pre-drowning architecture decreases with each meter. This is not a hard law, it is a practical preference, a way to make the map realistic and the schedule bearable. Currents here are not afterthoughts. The Indonesian through flow, the river of the ocean that carries warm Pacific water through the archipelago into the Indian Ocean, slips and bends through straits and basins with moods that change by monsoon, by season, by the long breath of the El Niño southern oscillation. In the Java Sea, where the average depth allows wind to reach the bottom through pressure gradients, these currents can set sand in motion across large fields, writing ripples that slide like satin and then freeze on calm days, only to move again when wind returns from the opposite quarter. Those ripples line themselves up perpendicular to the flow, making the seafloor into a fabric whose weave can be read for direction and strength. Any line that defies that weave deserves skepticism and attention in equal measure. Skepticism, because wrecks and pipelines and the toys of the industrial age also draw straight lines. Attention, because nature prefers curves and gradients, and where straightness endures against the habit of water there may be stone that cares more about its own plan than about pressure. In the present mind, all this background is not filler but frame. Without the drowned plains and the migrating ravinement belt, a claim about underwater platforms is naked and either too bold or too vague. With them, the claim becomes a conditional path forward. If terraces or walls descend from the hill into the shelf, they would most likely lie along a ridge that once stood as local high ground on the Pleistocene plain. They would most likely be found now where depth and current and burial conspired to shield them from the worst erasers. They would most likely show their profile first as a hint in sonar, then as a stubborn edge in light, then as a tactile difference beneath a gloved hand. The negative space matters too. Finding long stretches of regular columnar jointing in basalt, dressed by waves into mimetic steps, would not be a failure but a different kind of answer, one that reframes the hill inland as a partnership between geology and human arrangement rather than a monument from an age that demanded a different calendar. The land tells this same story in dry cross-section when cut by roads and quarries and rivers. West Java's hills are layered with tuffs and lavas, pale ash and dark flows, soils that pause as paleosols between events to catch their breath and record a period of stability before being buried again. In core samples, these transitions are crisp. A granular ash becomes a compact clay with root traces, then another ash lies atop like a grey snowfall frozen in place. Time between these bands varies wildly, and within those windows of quiet, people could have built and walked and burned wood for fires that later lend their carbon to dating efforts. When those bits of carbon are found within deeper layers under terraces, the temptation is to assign the age of the carbon to the age of the architecture. The geology advises caution. Carbon moves. Old wood burns in new fires. Roots carry fragments down, and burrowing animals create small elevators that take lighter bits farther than intuition expects. The shelf magnifies these tendencies, subdividing time and space more finely as water finds each pathway. All of which returns thought to method, because on a shelf like this, argument must be tied to instruments and sequences rather than to flashes of conviction. A multibeam echo sounder reads the bottom in swaths, building a model of relief so rich that it becomes a small world in its own right. With each pass, shallow ridges grow more distinct, gullies more tense with shadow. Sidescan sonar paints texture across that relief, giving each patch a grain and a tone, the difference between hard and soft, between smooth plain and rough rubble. A sub-bottom profiler sends a softer pulse into the sediment and listens for the whispers that return from layers beneath the first visible surface, a way of seeing through sand to the older floors below. Together, these instruments can distinguish a flat bedrock surface dusted by a thin sheet of sand from a mound whose skin hides a different core, a necessary distinction when looking for hard, human-made shapes under blankets of nature's litter. Where the instruments find a pattern that repeats across angles and passes, the body goes next. Divers or remotely operated vehicles bring eyes into close range, where light plays tricks and the same corner becomes more or less right-angled depending on the distance and the crawl of algae. Touch matters. The difference between a joint in cooling basalt and a mortar line is a difference of finger and nail as much as a pixel. A joint is clean but irregular in a way that resists hand tools. A mortar line carries grit where finger meets it, and sometimes the sandy breath of a century of micro-erosion sticks to its creases in ways that a natural seam does not. A dressed face is flat across scales, a clever and enviable quality that waves and chemical dissolution rarely produce on their own. None of these differences are perfect tests. They are hints that succeed when multiplied and fail when isolated. If this sounds like the opposite of epiphany, that is because it is, and the geology insists on that humility. Towering over all of this is the equatorial calm that reshaped the crust itself. Near the equator, the rebound of land from lost ice is smaller, not absent, but quiet, and in its place tectonics holds the pen. Java's south coast rises and subsides by millimeters a year in places, years that added together become meters in the span that matters to archaeology. The shelf to the north, while not immune to flexures of the crust, has enjoyed a relative stability enhanced by its distance from the trench, a stability that makes its drowned valleys more legible and its relic shorelines more persistent. In certain places, carbonate platforms grew like patient cities, adding layer upon layer as sea level rose, pinning a calendar to their sequences and building walls that later confused searchers by their regularity and their insistence on straight edges. A first glance can misread a coral reef as masonry, and a second glance can correct it without sorrow, remembering that corals are architects with a better claim to the title than any passing visitor. Weather writes chapters here as well. Monsoon winds reverse with the year, exchanging the language of the sky between hemispheres and reversing currents in the basin like a slow pendulum. During one half of the year, rivers deliver more sediment, and plumes spread like brown veils over the shelf, dropping load where flow slows and hiding features beneath a film of silt. During the other half, clearer water sharpens the relief, allowing cameras to see farther and eyes to relax into longer stares. Storms are small compared to typhoons elsewhere, but their short fetch in a shallow sea makes for steep waves that stir the bottom from time to time and undo pockets of careful observation. Planning must bend to this rhythm, advancing in seasons tuned to visibility and slack currents, returning to the same coordinates when maximum clarity is most likely rather than when schedules on land are convenient. None of this slow description leaves the subject behind. It holds it with more care. The narrative at sea is not is there a pyramid or not, but what does the world here do, and what could survive inside that behavior? The submerged megalith idea breathes more easily within the lungs of drowned floodplains and lahar blankets than it does in a vacuum of romance, because it can then claim not that it defied the world to persist, but that it hid inside the world's habits to wait. Those habits include erasure and preservation, reshaping and protection, and they have pet preferences for depth ranges and substrate types and current speeds. They have favorite geometric counterfeits that must be recognized and set aside before the mind can clear for what remains. To the west and north, on the wider shelf, drowned deltas lie where rivers once spilled into bays that no longer exist, their mouths fossilized as fans of slightly coarser material that create subtle hummocks and patches of different acoustic return. To the east, in channels between islands, bed forms organize themselves into trains of dunes too large for legs and too small for mountains, reminders that the bottom is not a static page but a slow conveyor that will carry a pebble far given enough seasons. Across all of it, human time makes brief marks, a trawl scar here, a lost cable there, an anchor-s groove that runs as straight and unapologetic as a ruler. Sorting these from things that matter is part of the craft, done by layers of evidence rather than by glances. Toward the heart of the question, the ridge that might carry terraces seaward has to be understood not as a line drawn by a claimant but as a piece of geology, a resistant seam or a topographic grain that started before people and allowed people to co-opt it. Lava flows tend to choose paths, and subsequent flows tend to honor those choices, building stacks that later erode into aligned highs. A ridge like that can run beneath soil and then beneath sea, a surname that the land keeps through marriage into water. If platforms were set along its back when it was dry, their bones might now lie along that same back, depressed by the weight of new sediment but not destroyed, thinly buried where currents are weak, more deeply buried where fine material funnels in and rests. The task is to find that surname in the maps and then see if the genealogy includes any adopted children. Beneath the mythic, there is a lesson about scale that sleep helps to internalize. Human hands operate readily in centimeters and meters. Waves and currents like meters and tens of meters. Basins and shells prefer kilometers and hundreds of kilometers. The crossover zones are where misreadings breed. A 10-meter ripple field looks large enough to be deliberate until the mind recalls that water moving in a shallow basin can herd sand in ways that ignore the small ambitions of masonry. The basalt column that measures 30 centimeters across and runs for meters in length will look like a wall from afar, but up close, the subtle taper and the slight curvature of each prism reveal their parentage in physics rather than in quarried block. Distance lies often because brains evolved to survive on land, not to decipher sonar. This second movement of the story, then, is a lullaby made of process. It sets the stage for arguments about dates and extensions by lining the floor with the right materials: drowned river valleys, shelf benches, ravinement scars, lahar caps, coral drapes, current ripples, and the patient handwriting of a sea that spent millennia erasing and preserving in equal measure. In that light, claims of 20,000 years do not sound like thunder dropping from a clear sky. They sound like one possible reading of a palimpsest that has many layers and expects many readers. In that light, the idea of an underwater extension from a hill of terraces does not sound like a ladder laid implausibly into the deep. It sounds like a modest proposal to look along a ridge that already has reasons to exist, in depths that make geological sense, for shapes that can survive if they were ever there to begin with. The ethics of attention that run beneath the narrative ask for exactly this pace. To rest inside the rules of the Sunder shelf is to grant the future parts of the film the dignity of method. When a sequence later shows a sonar image that suggests a corner, the memory will call up the list of counter-explanations and the map of nearby channels, measuring enthusiasm against context. When a camera later finds a ledge, the memory will test its flatness against known behaviors of cooling flows and joint sets, asking whether the plane is too perfect for fracture to explain. When a sample later comes to light with shells attached, the memory will remember that shells date the colonization and not the construction, and will look for ways to triangulate the age of human intention from non-human clocks. In the cabin, the chart on the table becomes a character in its own right. Each new layer of bathymetry increases its confidence, each pass of side scan adds texture, each core taken, even if only of silt that whispers recent, adds a point to the calibration curve that will someday guide a stronger claim. The shelf does not hide secrets like a trickster, it hides them like a library, where most books are boring and repetitive and some are manuals and some are memoirs and very few are revelations, and the job is to read until fatigue becomes fluency. Patience here is not ornamental. It is the shape of truth in a place where the ground moved under the feet of ancestors and then moved again, and where water finished the work by writing light over their traces until only careful instruments and careful minds can recover what was left. If the imagination is tempted to run ahead into the house of extraordinary antiquity, the geology gently returns it to the porch, asking it to name the rooms before visiting them. There will be time for ages and for arguments about who built and why and how many seasons passed between the first stone placed and the first stone buried. There will be time for the social weather that gathers whenever ideas this large meet the limited patience of bureaucracies and the unlimited appetite of headlines. But this is the part of the night when scales matter more than names, when the autochthonous habits of a shelf come forward like a tide itself, teaching without sermon, asking nothing in return except a slow heartbeat and steady breath. It is enough, for now, to hold a few coordinates in mind and a few depths in favor, to accept that a drowned land can nurture a durable rumor, and that the only remedy for rumor is a calmly built picture. In that picture, the Sunder shelf is not a mystery but a context, not an excuse but a reason. Rivers that no longer flow still arrange the sand where they once ran. Volcanoes that no longer erupt still hold ridges where they once cooled. The sea that rose did not rise all at once, and the windows it left for survival are wide enough to be plausible and narrow enough to be worth searching with precision. If an underwater staircase waits, it will lie within this net of conditions. If the shelf offers only the beautiful order of cooled stone and migrating sand, that will be a different kind of staircase, one that climbs toward a modest satisfaction rather than a staggering revelation, and that staircase is no less worth taking in the quiet hour before dawn. Dawn reaches the terraces inland before it paints the flat light across the Java Sea, and the hill called Gunung Padang receives it the way a staircase receives footsteps, each riser taking a thin line of gold while the shadows between the stones still hold the night. From a distance the hill looks like a rumpled shoulder of the landscape, but as the path steepens the texture resolves into prisms of basalt lying in careful ranks, a pattern that feels both accidental and arranged, both cooled by the earth and laid by a hand that understood what weight can do when asked to behave. Here the thesis of the voyage meets its first ground truth underfoot, because if the sea might hold a drowned extension of a terrace, the land must first show what a terrace looks like when it is awake and touched by sun and wind and the slow rub of sandals. These blocks are the children of fire, not of quarries in the way limestone cities are cut from cliffs, but of molten rock that rose and cooled and cracked along the logic of temperature and stress, splitting into columns that prefer regularity the way frost prefers lace on a pane. Columnar jointing is the geologist's phrase for this quiet miracle, and it makes hexagons and pentagons and long prismatic beams that stack like organ pipes or topple like bundles of pencils for anyone to borrow and arrange. A hillside cut by weather and time will offer these beams in profusion, spilling them down slopes in talus and rimming them along benches where the base has not yet gone. A person with patience and a vision for a platform need not mind new shapes when the hill is already littered with them. The genius of such a place is that nature does most of the manufacturing and people do the fitting, a collaboration that leaves a signature subtler than a quarry face and more ambiguous than a carving, a signature that asks for field craft rather than for declarations. Walking the levels, the eye learns a rhythm that will matter later when the camera drops through water. Courses of stone run side by side along edges that face outward, and behind them fill material smooths a surface where feet might gather, where ceremonies might settle into habit simply because the sight gives them an address. Some faces are too flat to be accidents of fracture, some corners are too insistent to be simply the slumping of a slope. But between those confident lines lies rubble that betrays gravity's constant meddling, and between flat plains lie joints where moss has made a living by collecting dust and breath and the oils of hands. The whole hill is an argument between structure and fall, a long negotiation whose outcome changes with each season's rain and each year's work by visitors who stack a loose block back into place or leave it a little askew for the next set of steps to explain. Legends use simpler tools than surveys, but they remember places that reward repetition. Stories speak of kings and giants and the work of a single night, and whether the names belong to real courts or to the architecture of memory hardly matters to the way a terrace teaches those who climb it to breathe more slowly and to look across the valley with a rhythm that suits compelling spaces. Offerings left at corners become anchors for recollection, alignments with a distant peak become invitations to watch the year turn by the movement of light and shadow. The hill gathers human time without needing to announce an epoch in numbers. It keeps faith with use, and this faith is written in where, not in inscriptions, in the slight curvature of steps where footsteps prefer the same arc, in the smoothing of otherwise rough stones where hands meet them without being asked. Beneath the surfaces touched by day, the hill keeps layers that must be read one by one, a stratigraphy of events where ash beds lie like thin winters and soils lie like quiet summers, where boulders mark slides and lenses of charcoal mark fires whose reasons are as varied as hunger, ceremony, and chance. In some cores and cuts, charcoal appears far below the stones that now hold the sky, and the numbers drawn from that carbon ask for attention because they speak in the language of millennia, sometimes of tens of millennia, pushing imagination back to moments when the Sunda Shelf was still a country of rivers and the terraces would have looked onto a world that kept different coastlines and different winds. The excitement of such numbers is natural and necessary, but the hill requires a kind of listening that keeps its own counsel and does not confuse the date of a fire with the date of a wall. Wood migrates, roots drill, burrowers move what they do not understand, and when a surface is buried by a sudden fall of ash or a slow rain of slope wash, its contents can descend in ways that make the clock seem to run backward unless the reader is patient. On the surface, there is geometry; beneath it, there are signatures of processes that can mimic intention or respect it in layers. Radar that looks into the ground can find contrasts between dense and less dense zones, and those contrasts sketch shapes that a hopeful mind can read as chambers or as cores of older stone beneath the reworked faces, while a more cautious mind reads them as the natural heterogeneity of volcanic ground where flows meet breccias and where voids collect along cooling fractures. Resistivity will do the same in a different dialect, sending a current and hearing a different tone where moisture and composition change abruptly with depth. In each case, the measurements are real and compelling, but their interpretation walks a narrow path between what could be built and what simply formed under conditions that assemble order even when no one is asking them to. If samples are taken, their stories reflect both the place they left and the path they took to the lab. Volcanic islands teach humility by putting old material in young places, by dropping ancient fragments into modern contexts, by mixing flows and falls with the debris of slopes until a finger's width can encompass centuries of difference. A slice of organic matter sealed beneath a bench is a valuable witness, but the role it played in the scene must be established without romance. Did a fire sweep a hillside that happened, later, to be the pillow beneath a platform? Did an earlier surface, once open to the sky, become trapped within a later terrace as fill, carrying its age forward without transferring its date to the stones that now sit above it? These questions will be unfair to any easy answer and kind to any slow study, because the hill is generous with possibilities and sparing with certainties until they have been earned in daylight. If the terraces look outward like a theater, the stage they face is not only the valley but the corridor of geology that runs from their feet toward the sea, a grain in the land that continues beyond the modern shoreline and becomes the seafloor's subtle relief. It is tempting to draw a straight line from a dressed edge on the hill to a shadow on a sonar screen and call them kin. It is wiser to first follow the ridge by its own rules, to walk its back on maps and in channels, to note where its shoulders widen and where its spine is cut by gullies that would have served as gullies even when the land was dry. From those notes, a few coordinates emerge where the past landscape and the present claim overlap in more than hope. They are places where the drowned plain once rose a little, where currents now slacken, where sand thins and rock shows its own opinions, where it is not crazy to imagine that a platform built on land could have survived drowning and gentle burial and still hold a partial shape waiting for someone to notice it from a moving deck. The feel of the stones underfoot calibrates the eye for what counts as human at any depth. Where the columns lie in heaps, their orientations are mixed and their ends do not share a plane. Where people have insisted on purpose, the ends face together in a line even when the stones are irregular, and the top surfaces agree on a level that is persuasive across a distance wider than a ripple. The terrace edges teach how to weigh that agreement against the deceit of a good outcrop. Basalt can make a step so perfect that a camera frame would swear it was hammered, and then the next meter will betray it by a warp that no mason would accept unless planning something curved and clever that this place does not attempt. Exactness travels in bands on the hill, and the distance over which exactness holds is part of what makes a claim either strong or hollow. That distance, learned with boots and breath, is the same distance that matters when a diver measures a ledge with a gloved hand and watches a line refuse to end as drift algae flows past like green hair. Around the terraces, the hill keeps quieter artifacts that belong to life lived among stones rather than stones alone. Potsherds rest in soil pockets where water pauses, chert flakes lie where hands once tried edges against light, beads turn up in screens with a smile attached to the sieve because they are small and improbable and public in their beauty. These things carry their own clocks and their own contexts, and they whisper of communities that visited or lingered and made meaning here in chapters that could be centuries apart. Their presence complicates impatience by making any single age unlikely. They support a portrait of continuity and reuse, of people returning to a location that the landscape itself had already chosen as a focus because of how it sits and faces and collects wind and time. Above it all, the line of volcanoes gives a sense of cadence to the hill's history. Dormant cones on the horizon are not dead, they are pauses in a score that will add notes when it wishes. Ash on the terraces will not be a single layer, but a range of layers whose thickness and grain size tell of different moods of eruption and wind. Lahars that never reached this particular hill will still have altered the rivers below and the ways people moved around it, changing how often and how easily they visited and what they brought in their hands and on their backs. The hill is both sight and witness, both built and bounded by the wider engine that shaped the arc of land from which it climbs. When thinking about any extension into the sea, that engine remains present, because it dictates which ridges are real, which hollows are ephemera, and which stories about drowning and burial draw from plausible physics rather than from the hunger for extraordinary exception. All of this matters in the night work on the water because it anchors the test of kinship between land and sea. If a ledge below the surface holds its level as stubbornly as the terrace holds its own above, that kinship strengthens. If a corner underwater keeps its angle through a sweep of the camera as reliably as a corner on the hill keeps its crispness against the morning light, the argument can breathe with a little more confidence. If the basalt below is of a fabric that matches what lies on the hill, if its jointing and grain and the way it breaks when pressed by tools sings the same notes, then the possibility of a seaward continuation becomes not a leap but a step. Conversely, if the underwater lines warp and mimic with that special slyness of columns fallen and dressed by waves, the mind returns happily to the collaboration thesis that the hill is partly human and partly world, and that the world repeats its favorite grammar wherever it can, including on shelves covered by green water and drifting silt. There is an ethical quiet that grows in this comparison, a calm that reminds the storyteller that the most persuasive moments will be the most modest. A series of surfaces that keep their agreement across lengths longer than waves prefer. A staircase whose risers are not merely flat but harmonized. A wall whose face welcomes a right palm and denies a natural fracture with the same gesture. These will be enough to deserve stronger words, and until they appear, the best words are those that keep the door open without dragging the viewer across a threshold they cannot yet see. The hill teaches that, too, because it holds its grandeur in the accumulation of small insistences rather than in a single shocking gesture. It wins by repetition, by the feel of level after level, by edges that face out to space at distances that are not enormous and not trivial, just human. When the camera returns to the terraces in daylight later in the story, it will find good company in the voices that are most careful with the hill. Those who have measured and mapped without a desire to claim a revolution will show lines and notes and photographs that honor ambiguity as a necessary companion and not a flaw. They will point to repairs, to recent walls that echo older ones, to piles that belong to the 19th century as much as to the 9th or the much earlier centuries some have proposed for layers that are not clearly architectural. They will remind the film that sites live, that communities use and reuse, that a terrace can be both a relic and a workshop, both a shrine and a playground in different hours of the same day. This living complexity protects the story from freezing into a single era and allows it to hold the tension of the CS question without impatience. As the sun rises higher, heat draws cicadas into their invisible choir, and the view from the upper platforms opens. The valleys below are not empty. Fields carry the same careful geometry as the stones underfoot, and footpaths choose the same curves that water chose before humans learned to canalize its impulses. It is tempting to assign intelligence to landscapes and then to stop at the romance, but the better habit is to recognize that intelligence is sometimes recognition rather than invention, that to build where a ridge invites is not laziness but respect. If an extension into the sea exists, it will likely honor this same respect for grain and place. It will follow what the land already offered, and because of that, it will sit where maps and models say it should if people were paying attention and building within their means and within their weather. The claim gains dignity by becoming predictable rather than miraculous. Before leaving the hill for the water again, there is a last touch worth taking: a stone face that has not been regarded for a while, one that shows the difference between a cut and a break in the language of lichen. Where a chisel once passed, even lightly, the microtopography is interrupted in a way biota respect as a new microclimate, colonizing its roughness differently from the adjacent field. Where a break followed a joint, lichen obeys the broader logic of grain and moisture and washy textures. These are small things, measured in millimeters, but they inform the hands that will later feel along an underwater angle, telling them what kind of grit to expect if a tool has ever been there, what kind of friction belongs to the natural unfurling of a fracture. It is in these scales, the almost invisible scales, that certainty can be assembled from experience, and that assembly is the most persuasive music a calm film can make. Leaving the terraces, the path descends through shrub and shade. The hill recedes behind a screen of leaves, and it becomes a shape against the sky rather than a surface under a hand. The memory keeps the rhythm of the steps, and that rhythm will become the cadence of the next portion of the search offshore, the way a metronome gives both permission to linger and a promise to move. The boat waits with its humming interior, the screens ready to draw again. Under the hull, the drowned plane waits with its own patience, and the ridge that may or may not carry the signature of these terraces waits in silence, holding either a map of nature's normal excellence or a whisper of human insistence that has slept since the world last counted the coastline differently and the sun rose over a wider expanse of land than it does today. The narrative remains careful because the hill remains careful. It is grand without pleading, persuasive without proof beyond argument, and generous in how it suggests angles and lines that the sea might echo if given the chance. In this restraint there is strength. The film can afford to take the time to show how a terrace looks when it is simply itself, how a basalt prism behaves when asked to be a step, how a course of stones handles a corner when the intention is to endure many seasons and to welcome many feet. That time spent will pay interest when a similar corner appears under a skein of algae, when a similar course resists the drag of a current just enough to keep its agreement through the camera's turn. As evening returns and the hill becomes once more a silhouette, the question that began over water and paused on land resumes its journey. Does a plan extend along the ridge, or does the ridge alone create the illusion of a plan? Are the numbers buried in the hill the beginnings of a new calendar for this corner of the world, or are they the dates of fires and soils and accidents that politely took up residence beneath a later architecture? Is the collaboration between geology and human arrangement on the terraces a clue for what to expect offshore, or a warning that the sea will give us beauty that sounds like intention even when intention was never there? These are not rivalries to settle in a sentence but companions to carry into the night, as the boat turns its bow toward the coordinates that the hill, with its quiet lessons, has suggested with a dignity that asks only for care in return. What remains before sleep is a simple affirmation that joins land and sea in a single breath. Stones remember through shape. Water remembers through pattern. People remember through stories and through the cautious repetition of good methods. If an underwater terrace sleeps below, it will be a stone shape to resist forgetting. If only the shelf's lovely geology lies ahead, it will be a pattern that teaches the same lesson about attention without needing a legend to make it matter. Either way, the hill has prepared the mind to see and the hand to feel, and the rest is a long, patient conversation with light and depth and the honest fatigue that comes when the day has been spent learning how to recognize a staircase by walking one until the soles are sure. Night work sharpens when numbers enter the room, because numbers carry a hush that even the sea respects, a gravity that pulls attention into a smaller circle where hands slow down and pencils click and the hum of instruments turns into a background heartbeat. The claim that something at Gunung Padang might be older than 20,000 years is one of those numbers that rearranges the furniture in a mind, and it asks for a gentler voice, not because gentleness weakens scrutiny, but because gentleness keeps the doors open long enough for every careful question to come through in order. The air in the cabin feels cooler when the dates are laid out. Radiocarbon ages pinned to threads of charcoal from depths beneath visible terraces. Hints from geophysics of hidden geometry under soil and stone. Stories of cores drilled through layers that seem to alternate between nature's bedding and the suggestion of something made to hold shape against time. It is a plot with all the familiar characters of deep time, carbon and clay, ash and fracture, signals real and signals misread, evidence that sits where it was left and evidence that wandered politely before being found by someone eager to give it a speaking role. Radiocarbon is the watch with the kindest face in archaeology, but its hands do not always point to the wall that is being described. Charcoal is memory in the most literal sense, an artifact of fire that kept the chemistry of life long enough to be counted after death. When a core knocks a pinch of charcoal free and brings it back to light from meters below a terrace, the lab can put a number on the last breath of that carbon, and that number can indeed sit far beyond the usual timelines of stone arrangement in the archipelago. The temptation is to let that breath become the breath of the terrace itself, to say the stones were already singing in a choir when the wood burned nearby. But between the breath and the choir lies context, and context is the stage that only patient stratigraphy keeps clear of props that wandered in from another scene. Old wood can enter a younger situation as easily as an heirloom wicker chair can be carried into a new house. Roots braid through layers and leave filaments that look fixed but are the result of slow, elegant trespass. Burrowing creatures build a complex of micro-elevators that move particles up and down through time without announcing the journey to a future corer. This is not skepticism for its own sake, it is the kindness that radiocarbon needs to remain honest. For the age of architecture to meet the age of charcoal, the two must share more than proximity. They must share a sealed moment. A floor surface, say, that suffered a fire and was buried quickly in a way that prevents downward drift. A mortar matrix whose organic inclusions belong to its making and not to the later life of the soil around it. A post hole with in situ carbonized fibers at its bottom that cannot plausibly have arrived there after the hole was filled and forgotten. These are the ways that numbers and stones shake hands without either party pretending too much. Without them, the handshake is ambiguous, and ambiguity has its own right to be preserved, especially in stories that pass so near to thresholds that, once crossed, are hard to recross with grace. Above the lab benches, the atmosphere of geophysics flickers like an aurora, ground-penetrating radar that sends radio waves down into Earth and listens for echoes at boundaries between different materials, resistivity surveys that feel the electrical moods of the subsurface, magnetics that are alert to the presence of iron-rich bodies and the direction they prefer to orient themselves. On a hillside, these tools can reveal order where eyes see only a mosaic of stones and grasses and shadows. A repeated pattern of reflectors at regular intervals, a zone of consistent high resistivity shaped like a rectangle, a sharp contrast where one would expect a gentle gradient if only nature were in charge. Such lines look like whispers of rooms and walls drawn in numbers and returned as ghostly lines on a printout. But geology is a spirited artist in its own right. Basalt flows cool into columns, and those columns can make radar sing because they are different enough from the rubble around them to stand out as a pattern even if no hand ever aligned them for human use. Slope processes can sort material by size into benches and lenses that mimic the clean edges of plans drawn by people. Weathered joints can create hollows that fill with soil and hold moisture in ways that make electrical measurement sketch shapes that resemble voids and chambers. The discipline here is not to distrust instruments, but to demand that instruments be fluent together before they are asked to narrate alone. A radar pattern that suggests a wall should find a friend in a resistivity map that tells of dryness where stones are thick and of moisture where soil dominates. A magnetics map should be wary of the way basalt itself can imitate the signatures of human fire or iron, and a careful survey will try to tune its ears so it hears the tune of built space differently from the tune of cooled stone. Wherever possible, ground truth returns the conversation to the simplest language. A trench across a line that radar likes. A small window into a resistive rectangle-esque corner. A core that is not just deep but smart, aimed at a stratigraphic question whose answer would make two datasets agree for reasons that do not depend on hope. In all of this, the number 20,000 sits like a bright buoy on a grey sea. It calls the eye even when the navigation plan says to scan the whole horizon. 20,000 years ago, the Sunda shelf was still dry in many places that now lift only fish into sunlight. Rivers crossed a plain that people could have known well enough to call home. It would not be impossible for someone to have moved stones into a pattern we would now read as architecture. But possible is only the beginning of plausible. The habit of architecture at that scale in that time and place is a set of question marks that deserve sentences as answers, and those sentences need subjects and verbs in the form of contexts that make sense on land and on the shelf alike. A terrace without tools is a staircase without feet. A platform without debris of life is a theater without echo. If those echoes are present flakes from shaping stone, fragments of pottery if the time allows it, the residues of fire in places that make sense for hearths and not only for accidents, then numbers begin to have neighbors, and neighbors give numbers a neighborhood to live in rather than leaving them as noble loners. Calibration curves add another layer of quiet complexity, the way a tide chart complicates a simple loyalty to the phases of the moon. Radiocarbon does not translate directly to calendar years because the breath of the world has not been steady through time. The concentration of the isotope in the atmosphere rises and falls with solar moods and with the slow exhalations of oceans and forests, and the curves that bend laboratory ages into calendar ages carry plateaus and wiggles that make some numbers more frustrating than others. Ages around certain millennia flatten, spreading probability more widely than the formally stated error suggests, and a date may be said to live across a band that is generous enough to include centuries that belong to very different moments in human story. In the tropics, Reservoir effects can add further mischief if the carbon sampled came in part from sources not in swift exchange with the air, like certain dissolved carbonates in groundwater systems that move sluggishly through rock and bring old ages to new springs. Each of these cautions is a kindness in disguise. They prevent numbers from telling stories they cannot bear. Where the conversation leaves the ground and enters the air of journals and conferences, heat sometimes rises, not because any single dataset carries a fever, but because the stakes feel high in ways that invite rhetoric ahead of patience. Publications that announce old ages for contexts that look architectural attract praise and alarm in equal measure. Praise because they promise to widen the frame through which the tropics are seen. Alarm because they risk moving a long wall of consensus with a short lever of ambiguous context. Corrections and retractions have their own weather gusts of commentary, drafts of speculation about motives and mechanics. Within that weather, the cold facts of method remain the only real shelter, raw data shared in formats others can test, trenches drawn on maps others can visit, samples archived in ways others can request and remeasure, chains of custody and handling recorded with a boring fidelity that is the opposite of narrative and the heart of trust. The phrase academic suppression surfaces in currents like these because humans are social long before we are scholarly, and any strong filter feels like a gate being guarded rather than a sieve being cleaned. It is hard to accept that the obstacles are sometimes just the hard stone of method and not a wall of malice built by colleagues. It is also naive to pretend that institutions are frictionless or that reputations and biases play no role in how quickly or warmly a claim is received. The graceful path through this tangle is to keep two candles lit at once. One candle illuminates rigor, the checklists of documentation, the invitations to replicate, the embrace of alternative readings consistent with the same data. The other candle reveals humility, the willingness to admit error, to trim a claim's sails to fit the wind that the best counter-arguments send across the deck, to resist making the data say more than their native language allows. In that light, what some call suppression looks often like the ordinary weather of review, and what some call persecution looks often like a correction asked for by the most boring but vital part of scientific culture. As these human thermals pass over the hill and the sea, the instruments do not change their minds. A sub-bottom profile remains a set of echoes, a carbon count remains a ratio, a sonar return remains a texture. The story they can tell changes only as interpretations become commensurate with more lines of evidence. And even then, the story is patient. If the older ages cluster consistently beneath surfaces that are only explicable as made, if the geophysics finds rectangles that are not mimicked anywhere nature can plausibly have arranged its columns and plates, if the trench that tests those rectangles reveals joints that have been tamed into courses and surfaces that have been leveled across distances that cannot be the accident of a slope's rhythm, if the underwater ridge yields the same degrees and the same stubbornness against current, and algae, if the cores in the seabed capture sands and ash in a sequence that reads as a drowning of a prepared surface rather than the settling of a random sheet, then the mind is allowed to let the buoy of 20,000 become a mooring rather than a temptation. The burden of proof is not punitive, it is proportionate to the wonder invited. On the shelf, the translation of that burden into practice becomes a path that was sketched already in thought. First, chart the relief with care, marking the benches and shoulders where a terrace could sit or a wall could hold. Then scan in texture for lines that maintain their identity across passes and headings, pareidolia kept at bay by the repetition of angles that survive scrutiny rather than thrive only in favored frames. Then listen beneath the skin of the sand for older surfaces that remain surprisingly planar at depths where dunes should sleep, where the sub-bottom suggests a gap or a sharp contact that could be the preserved interface of a drowned floor. Then look, slowly, with light and fingertip, for the soft certainty of a tool mark where nature's fracture cannot make one, for the rasp of a mortar seam where a joint would instead read as a cleft with a different kind of patience. If any of those points of contact are found and logged, if samples are taken with context that can be retold by strangers, the lab work becomes lighter and more serious at once. Radiocarbon samples tied to construction rather than to occupation or accident, optically stimulated luminescence ages from sands directly beneath a floor that say when those sands last saw light before being covered, uranium-thorium dates from coral encrustations that fix the minimum age of inundation, microfossils in trapped silts that speak of brackish or fresh conditions at the time of burial. The dates then cluster into meaningful sentences. A surface laid around a certain calendar window, smothered by a particular lahar or flood whose ash or silt can be correlated to other records in the region, drowned after a particular threshold in sea level curves, colonized by coral slow enough to make the timeline feel more human and less cosmic. Suddenly the buoy is not alone, it shares a line with other markers, and the line becomes a path a viewer can walk with real confidence. Inside the cabin, the human part of this sequence often stumbles at the same place, the desire to name a revolution before the data can hold its weight. The remedy is to make the hero of the chapter not the age, but the procedure. Viewers drift better and sleep better when the mystery is handled in a way that makes them feel the gentle firmness of good practice. Showing the pile of cores, labeled and logged, is not dull, it is calming. Hearing the cadence of lab names and chain of custody statements is not bureaucratic, it is musical, if the score of the film is tuned to hear the virtue in repetition. Watching a trench open and then close with careful backfill and flagged GPS points has a visual rhythm that matches the CS slow beat. If the numbers that emerge from that choreography support the oldness and the extension, the audience will recognize that the wonder has been earned. If they do not, the same audience will appreciate the different wonder, the discovery that a beautiful geology can sing a clear note without the need to attach a legend to its throat. It is here, in the quiet insistence that method is meaning, that the underwater question softens into something a night listener can hold without anxiety. The mind is asked to do almost nothing except respect sequence. Pick a ridge for reasons that geology would bless. Scan and rescan until angles pay rent without complaint. Ground truth whenever a ghost draws a straight line twice. Date only where context will be proud to host the result. Decline fame before evidence, invite critique before applause. If something truly old and truly built lives in this corridor, it will survive this kindness and become clearer with each cycle of the tide. If it does not, it will dissolve back into the splendid commonplace of basalt and sand and coral, and the film will leave behind an even more valuable artifact than a verdict, a feeling for how to be exact without becoming severe, how to be enchanted without becoming credulous. On land, dawn becomes day and the shadows that gave the terraces their drama fade into a more clinical view. Underwater, day softens to twilight within meters, and the floodlights on a remotely operated camera become small suns that hold a circle of clarity in a world where clarity is rationed. The crew learns the habit of patience again. Each pass is an erasure of the last until the shape holds. Each shape is a question disguised as an answer until a hand confirms it, and even then the hand is only a messenger to the minds waiting above. Numbers will arrive later, wrapped in plastic and paperwork, and their first pronunciations will be whispers in instruments before they are translated into a prose that can be read aloud without shame to those who make a living out of skepticism. In this slow exchange, 20,000 changes its tone. It becomes not a headline but a coordinate, not a promise but a possibility engraved on the same chart that shows where the bottom rises gently and where the silt has chosen to keep its sleep for a little while longer. In the evenings between dives and scans, the argument on land continues without sourness in this telling, because we can choose the version of the debate that belongs to mature curiosity rather than to theatre. Those who argue for great age can be afforded the courtesy of having their best evidence summarized with care and without straw, and those who argue for caution can be afforded the dignity of being heard without being cast as guardians of doorways that no one has in fact tried to close. The sequence of claims and replies becomes another kind of stratigraphy, an early paper that proposes, a response that notes problems with context, a revised method that tightens the handling of samples, a reanalysis that moves the mean age without discarding the whole, a quiet field season that adds thickness to the strata of knowledge, a new set of geophysical lines that replace earlier interpretations with ones that better match trenches. A new trench that unexpectedly complicates both sides and sends the entire conversation back to the instrument with a smile that says there is still work to be done. Between the last paragraph and sleep lies only a return to the boat's original vow, to prefer patience over proof and proof over proclamation, and to let the CS way with time be the teacher. If a staircase waits below, and if its earliest riser dates to a time when the Sunder Plain was still a home for feet that did not know how quickly the ocean would revise their maps, then the film will kneel and say the number aloud without trembling. If the staircase is a trick of columnar jointing, exquisite and instructive in its own right, the film will bow to that too and show how the mind learns to tell the difference and why the difference matters. In both endings, the audience will have been invited into the kind of attention that builds character and community around the work of knowing. And that, in the long run of stones and dates and maps and nights, is the architecture that lasts. Work at sea becomes a promise the moment the plan leaves the page and touches water, and tonight the promise is simple to say and intricate to keep: follow the ridge that carries the hill-esque grain into the shelf, test it where geology would expect strength to endure, and ask the bottom to answer with shapes that either agree with intention or settle into the beautiful habits of stone and sand and current. The boat hums with that intention. Cables are coiled and ready. The winch is patient. The screens wait for the first swath of depth to paint its soft relief, and with it the first decision points, because a search like this advances not in leaps but in a sequence of small, careful choices that align until they resemble confidence. The chart shows the ridge as a muted uplift amid pale contours, a subtle shoulder on the drowned plain where river ghosts still draw their fine, branching signatures. We start with the broadest brush, multi-beam mapping to give the bottom a face. In shallow shelf water, the frequencies climb high, painting a wide swath with each pass and returning a clean, shaded surface where benches and scarps resolve into shadowed forms. The helmsman steers in neat, overlapping lanes, creating a stitched quilt of relief where voids recede and texture approaches. The first hours are always the same, the bottom appears as if waking, a smooth field gathering wrinkles and folds until it looks less like a floor and more like a landscape. Ridges elongate. Depressions organize. The ridge we seek holds its line with modest confidence, the sort of feature that a builder would have found obvious when the plain was dry and the rivers ran luminous in the morning. Once the relief is honest, texture follows. Sidescan sonar drifts its gaze along the bottom and measures not height but character, how the sea returns sound from roughness and smoothness, from sand and stone, from biology and bear. In these mosaics, a flat ledge reads as a cool, even tone, while rubble breaks the image into speckled grain. Lines stand out. A trawl scar runs as a crisp, pale stripe. A pipeline, if present, draws an artificial certainty that the eye quickly learns to ignore once it has seen a few. We avoid the known lanes of industry and focus on places where hard surface meets thin sediment, where a terrace could keep its edge and a wall could say, quietly, that it never agreed to be a dune. Pass after pass, the texture repeats and clarifies. Features that were wishes fade as the angle changes. A few remain. They keep their angles as the boat turns. They keep their tone as shadows slide. We mark them and withhold judgment, resisting the instinct to celebrate when patience has not yet earned a reason. Beneath the first skin of sand, older surfaces may wait, and we ask after them with a softer whisper, a sub-bottom profiler that sends a gentle chirp and listens for echoes within echoes. Where there is only shifting sand, the returns smear into haze. Where a firm surface lies a hand's breadth below, a crisp line appears, a horizon that should not be so linear unless something stiffer rides under the mobile sheet. It is here that the shell keeps its more interesting secrets, not in vaults but in thin blankets with shells and seams that catch against any firm geometry. If a prepared surface lies buried beneath a few hands of silt, the sub-bottom will hear it as an uncharacteristically straight reflector bounded by more ragged cousins above and below. Where we see such linearity, we draw boxes and arrows on the screen with childlike satisfaction, and then we force ourselves to behave like adults, adding a note that says only one word: verify. Verification, at sea, is the art of moving from suggestion to touch. We choose a slack tide when currents soften and visibility has its best chance. The ROV, an obedient and slightly theatrical creature, slides from its cradle into the green. A tether streams behind it in a slow arc. The pilot's hands settle. The camera begins to translate the model into fabric, sand that looks like velvet draped over a table, shells scattered like punctuation, worms writing their soft, calligraphic mounds along the lee of any interruption in flow. Then the first anomaly swims into view, and it is surprisingly plain. A ledge rises from the sand with a face that is flatter than a reef and less glossy than limestone. Its top holds a level that the pilot can believe in even as the image distorts through water and light. The corner is the test. Corners are the bottom's most seductive liars, and the camera circles, showing the edge from three sides. The angle holds, not perfectly, but with a stubbornness that matches in spirit the terrace memories inland. A gloved manipulator reaches out and traces the seam along the edge where face meets top. There is no mortar to betray. There is no tool mark obvious enough to be a signature. There is, however, a grain, a joint pattern that repeats at intervals that might be natural and might be tamed. The pilot steadies the machine and lingers. We add waypoints and build a perimeter around each candidate, walking, in the robot's way, the edges that define a possible platform. On one, the riser height seems consistent across several meters, as if a stair has kept its rhythm under algae and silt. On another, two planes face each other across a narrow negative space that reads like a corridor until the eye remembers how basalt columns can splay and leave a channel that mimics intention. We place rulers in the frame for scale and move slowly enough that even a sleepy viewer can feel the difference between a casual pan and the careful accumulation of evidence. The words in the narrator's mouth remain soft and careful. This could be. This might only look like. The tone repeats, massaging any rising urgency back into patience. Sampling is not a trophy hunt, it is the only way to let the lab speak a different dialect that the field cannot. We take small cores at the base of a straight face, choosing positions where the sub-bottom suggests a sharp horizon. We collect a plug of the face itself at a chipped edge, avoiding damage to features that could tell more with time than with a single scar. We brush aside a few centimeters of silt and record what lies directly on the surface: shell hash, little drifts of foraminifera, the fragile architecture of worm tubes that will shatter when touched and therefore must be recorded in place before any collection. When we find coral fixed to an edge, we take a fragment from its base, the point of first attachment, not because it says when the stone was placed, but because it says when the sea allowed life to claim it, a minimum for inundation that will later seat into a timeline like a peg into a board. The lab work breathes in cycles that match the CS, slow, repetitive, revealing. The sediment cores are split and photographed. Grain size curves are drawn and compared, looking for the sudden transitions that mark event layers, a Laha S-core signature interrupting a fine, estuarine hush, an ashfall S-sharp laminae lying like paper across a softer prose of mud. If a sharp contact sits directly beneath a planar surface, and if the material below reads as a soil horizon rather than a marine mush, we have the beginning of a story in which a surface was prepared on land and drowned before waves could undress it. If, instead, the contact is gradational and the laminations above and below are perfectly marine, we likely have a natural bench kept clean by currents and colonized in a way that hides its identity from distance but yields it readily to the polite insistence of sequence. Numbers arrive cautiously. Radiocarbon ages from any leaf fragments or charcoal trapped in basal fills will be the first to speak, and they will be introduced with all the caveats the Hill taught. A date that lies well back in time is a signal to look closer at context. Is the charcoal sealed by a flaw, or is it a stray older than the surface above it? OSL samples from sands that directly underlie a planar face can be trickier to obtain underwater but are worth the choreography, because those ages report the last time sunlight touched the grains before they were buried, a clock less inclined to wander than wood. Coral fragments deliver a minimum. We will hear how many years have passed since their crystallized skeletons captured the chemistry of the sea and locked it into an age. Each number joins a board on the wall where strings connect evidence to depth and position, and the strings begin to look less like a conspiracy and more like a loom doing honest work. Through all of this, a checklist keeps the soul of the enterprise tidy. Parallelism measured over distance that matters. Orthogonality that persists under rotation of view. Step height variation within a tight tolerance across more than a body length. Edge continuity despite sediment drape. Surface planarity beyond what columnar jointing alone tends to yield. Presence or absence of intentional fill between larger members. Microtopography consistent with tool finishing rather than with wave polishing. Biological colonization patterns that respect mortared seams differently from cooling joints. This is not a list for drama, it is the quiet spine beneath the film, the reason the images can be allowed to rest on screen for longer than usual without apology, because viewers are being trained to notice the small things that carry more weight than any proclamation. False positives are not failures, they are the price of honesty. A gorgeous right angle resolves, under touch, into two adjacent columns whose fractures coincidentally meet with theatrical tidiness. A flight of steps dissolves into a ramp where ripple shadows imposed a stair illusion on a long, gentle plane. A wall face turns out to be a slab broken from its bed and tilted into a stance that looks like a facade but crumbles into rubble a meter beyond the frame. Each time, the narrative does not flinch. It explains the misreading and shows how the test revealed it, training the eye not to be ashamed of hope but to tame it. Sleep has its pedagogy, and this is part of it, the slow building of criteria that will later make a single true angle, if it ever appears, feel earned rather than handed down. There is a human square in the chart room devoted to ethics and courtesy. Permits are more than paperwork, they are a covenant with the water and with the people who live by it. Notices to the fishing community go out with care so that trawl lines do not tangle in our slower drags and our tether does not suddenly sing with a strain that means someone else's day just worsened. When samples leave the country, if they must, they do so with letters that promise their return, with photographs and duplicates where possible, with the names of local colleagues attached to every analysis that will speak for them so that authorship does not become a theft dressed in a lab coat. We speak aloud the reason this matters, even in a film meant to calm, because beauty without respect is plunder, and knowledge without partnership is a noise the sea will not forgive. The ridge reveals itself to be a series of rooms, most empty, a few furnished with the kind of stubborn lines that reward repeated visits. We fly transects across and along, building a grid of experience that lets us see beyond the preference of any particular pass. In one box, a flat, rectangular panel emerges from the sand at a tilt, its upper edge clean, its sides lost near the bottom to a drape that looks thin enough to brush aside. We mark the corners, measure the top's straightness against a taut line in frame, and then move a meter away. Another panel shows, aligned and slightly lower, as if a step had slumped. If waves made these, they did so with a regularity that ignores their own laziness. If nature did, she used her favorite hexagons in a way that has trimmed away their curvature. We do not decide. We record. The decision, if it ever comes, will be an accumulation. At another site, a long, narrow trench runs between two higher planes, its bottom holding a filigree of life that prefers shelter. It reads like a corridor until the geology on the hill whispers through memory, cooling joints sometimes fan, leaving a slot that pretends to be a passage. We look for ends, for doors, for a change in width that would make the space more like a plan and less like a fracture. The width remains indifferent. The ends are messy rather than deliberate. We nod to nature and let her have this one, grateful for how clearly she taught us to be careful somewhere else. The weather enforces its own pedagogy. A squall reduces visibility to a green arm's length, and we pull the ROV, knowing that the sea will steal contrast for hours after the rain stops. Wind shifts. Waves steepen and shorten. Slack tides walk their narrow windows along the clock like reluctant guards. We adjust. The routine becomes a comfort: map, scan, verify, sample, log, rest. There is virtue in this cycle that a night voice can carry, the reassurance that work done right looks like a ritual, not like a conquest. As days unspool, the map grows dense with annotations. Some targets are retired with gratitude and a small smile at our earlier enthusiasm. Some remain in a category that is neither nor, waiting for one more pass in clearer water, one more core at the edge where silt thins to nothing and a surface can finally be touched without the slickness that hides its grain. A few, the precious few, begin to exhibit a personality that stands up to scrutiny. Their edges measure within centimeters of each other across spans that waves have had ample time to insult. Their planes oppose each other across empty space in a way that suggests agreement rather than coincidence. Their surfaces bear micro-scratches oriented more or less the same way, as if a tool or a repeated contact once insisted on direction. These are the features that earn the right to be explored with a different gravity on deck. The conversation in the cabin lowers in volume. Checklists are read aloud. The plan transitions from exploratory to confirmatory. If the shoreline were still where it once was, this would be a walk from the hill to the outworks, the moment when a causeway reveals itself not as a rumor but as a path. Underwater, the analogy is not perfect, but it is good enough to guide the mind. We proceed as if the argument might someday be made. The film carries this shift gently. The music does not swell. The voice does not sharpen. Instead, time lengthens around the images, letting the viewer's eyes do the work that usually belongs to edits and emphases. Corners are shown from multiple headings without hurrying. Fingers rest on surfaces to give texture to the gaze. Measurements appear in frame and linger, numbers held not as slogans but as simple facts. The silence between sentences stretches, allowing anyone watching to consider whether their own threshold for belief has been crossed or whether they are content to let possibility remain possibility for another night. Between watches, the land team checks in with their own patience. Tephra from a core ash layer is compared to known chemical fingerprints from eruptions in the region. If a buried surface sits beneath a blanket that matches a well-dated event, the bracket tightens. If the coral dates cluster in a band that agrees with sea level curves for when this depth would have transitioned from air to water, the bracket tightens further. If OSL on the sands beneath a flat face suggests darkness since a time when the shelf was narrowing into bays, the story gains coherence. No single number does this alone. They work as an ensemble, each one quiet, each one steady, none of them a hero demanding a spotlight. There are, even now, outcomes that will be both satisfying and contrary to the hungriest wish. A platform that is level and aligned may turn out to be beach rock, a carbonate cement that lithifies ancient shorelines into stubborn pavements, a natural architecture so persuasive that only close examination distinguishes it from intention. A series of steps can be the expression of a reef terrace staircase, coral growth adjusted to sea level still stands and jumps, holding planes at different depths in a way that maps level like a human builder but belongs to a colony's patient conversation with sun and tide. Knowledge does not collapse under these revelations. It expands. The claim that there might be architecture dissolves into the more durable claim that the sea writes in straight lines when its pens are coral and carbonate and time. We keep room for the other ending, careful and tender. In it, a suite of features passes every test we can devise and every correction we can imagine, and the lab S numbers and the maps lines and the field S touch agree often enough to ask the hardest and most delightful question plainly: could this be an extension of the hill S terraces built when the world S map was different and saved by a sequence of burial and luck? The answer, even then, would be measured. It would be a proposal wrapped in evidence dense enough to carry its own weight ashore, not a revelation shouted into wind. It would come with permissions for others to doubt and to test and to find and to revise. It would come with invitations rather than with headlines. And the film, faithful to its night mood, would let the wonder be an exhale instead of a roar, trusting that a true thing does not need to be loud to change the shape of a mind. For now, the ridge continues to teach. It offers easy illusions and hard truths with the same generosity. It holds platforms that are too clean to ignore and too ambiguous to claim without more work. It keeps a few secrets that may simply be secrets forever, human or not, because the sea rarely allows complete answers without charging a price in risk or in time that cannot be paid. The crew rests in narrow bunks between shifts, their bodies walking the motions of the boat even in sleep, their hands curled as if still holding the sticks that guide the camera through green and shadow. The plan for tomorrow waits on the chart, as simple and as demanding as ever: complete the grid, revisit the stubborn, sample where context welcomes, and accept what emerges without training it to say what the heart prefers. In this hour, as the generator settles into its lowest, kindest purr, the narrative can let go of argument and sink into the rhythm that has carried it from hill to sea and back. Observe, compare, test, share. That is the current we ride. Whether it delivers us to a staircase built before the sea took its breath and moved in, or to a shelf where stone and biology and motion have, by themselves, made the forms that satisfy the human appetite for shape, the current is honest and the destination will be enough. The Java Sea does not owe us a pyramid. It offers us a lesson in attention. An attention, practiced with care over this ridge and its quiet, granular promises, is the architecture that will stand long after the last pass of sonar and the last core has been labeled and tucked away to speak for itself in the dry, bright rooms on land. Night listens differently when the story turns to fire, because fire speaks in layers even after its light has long gone, leaving behind sheets of ash so delicate that a fingertip can smudge a century into silence and beds of boulder-laden mud that remember the sound of a mountain loosing its grip all at once. In Java, the mountains are not ornaments on the horizon but clocks and editors, deciding what gets written on the land and how long it remains legible, and if an underwater terrace truly survives on the shelf beyond the shore, then some chapter of this book of fire likely helped to hide it before the sea took up the pen and drew a line across the page. Begin with the simplest move that volcanoes make when rain learns their paths. A laha is a river that forgot it was water and became weight, a slurry of ash and rock and trees and whatever else a slope offers to movement, pouring down with a density that refuses to go around corners if going through them is faster. It behaves like fresh concrete in a hurry, filling hollows, draping benches, burying steps in single breaths that later harden into memory. On a ridge suitable for terraces, a laha's gift is paradoxical. It destroys the open air, but it preserves the shape beneath it by sealing edges from the sun and from the dogged fingers of wind and rain. Layers like this do not whisper, they declare. They settle with coarse grains and angular clasts that betray their source, their fabric often aligned by flow, their top grading into finer fractions as the wave of density loses strength and rests. If a set of steps was alive on such a ridge when the laha came, those steps would vanish from daylight and remain in time, their risers intact beneath the new surface like a melody buried under a louder line that will, in a later quiet, be heard again. Pyroclastic density currents keep their own grammar of burial. They are ground-hugging clouds with the temperature of revelation and the speed of decision, racing outward from a vent when a column collapses or a dome gives way. Their deposits, ignimbrites and surges, keep a smoother, finer record than lahas but carry the same habit of making time stand still beneath them. An ignimbrite sheet can sweep across a landscape like a single sentence, its base scouring, its middle deck carrying pumice and shards of glass, its top capping the story with a chilled rind that weathers differently than the heart. Where such a sheet drapes a terrace, it embalms the surface as if with intention, baking the soil beneath into a thin, brick-hued horizon that later reads as a contact baked by a brief, ferocious visit from the sky. That baked contact is a compass for field hands and for cores alike, a sharp line, a change in color, a change in magnetic susceptibility, a change in the way water meets the grains, all of them together telling a reader that something abrupt happened and that whatever lies below was living a different life before it fell asleep. Fallout ash, the gentlest of fire's letters, arrives in quieter weather yet is often the most faithful archivist, laying down as a powder that drifts to corners and gathers in level pools between stones. A single storm can smear it. A single clear day can leave it pristine. Over years, it becomes a series of fine bands that can be counted and cross-referenced if their chemistry carries a signature as distinct as handwriting. Tephrochronology is the art of matching these ash layers to their authors, reading the composition of glass shards and the balances of trace elements to say this was that mountain on that week of that year in the memory of the Earth. When such a layer caps a surface that looks prepared, the analyst's heart lifts, not because the age is won, but because a bracket has been gently built into place, a before and an after pinned by a known event that traveled on the wind and came to rest in silence. If that same layer lies beneath coral on the shelf, its calendar extends offshore in a way that lets land and sea share a date without ever speaking directly. Java is a chord, not a single note. Cones and calderas along the arc have taken turns over ages, sometimes whispering in ash and gas, sometimes shouting in lava and blocks, and sometimes speaking in the ambiguous murmur of long dormancy where springs and fumaroles keep the conversation warm beneath the quiet. The hill inland sits within this chorus, and the shelf north of it records what spills and surges escaped the gravity of slopes and found their way into lowlands that were later drawn under the sea. The drowned plain remembers not only the rise of water but the arrival of blankets that fell out of the sky or ran down from the uplands, creating those happy accidents of preservation that are best described as accidents only from the narrow point of view of human plans. The Earth plans differently. It composes in alternation, construction, pause, burial, exposure, pause, drowning. In that alternation lies the window where a terrace can be both completed and entombed before waves find it, a narrow aperture through which survival must pass if it hopes to keep even a fraction of its lines. If this seems like a plea for coincidence, it is not. It is a plea for sequence. The shelf's preservation habit depends on timing more than on luck. Imagine a terrace finished in a dry time when the plain still ran to the horizon. Along the southern skyline, a dome grows on a volcano that has been patient for a century. One year it collapses, and the pyroclastic current that follows runs outward along ravines and spills across the plain in a series of sheets and surges. Where the current thins at the limit of its run, it leaves only a few tens of centimeters a blanket, not a coffin enough to seal a surface from casual erosion and enough to leave a baked line beneath it. Within a few decades, the climate shifts enough to push sea level along its ongoing rise into a lane closer to the ridge. The ravinement belt, the moving eraser of breaking waves, scrapes forward for centuries, but by the time it reaches the site, the blanket of volcanic ash has hardened and is covered again by the first steps of marine silt. The waves spend their energy combing the new face. The old face remains a rumor beneath a skin. Later, as the sea settles into its modern breath, the terrace lies just beyond the depth where storms do their worst. It accumulates a gloss of life and a dust of sand and waits in the quiet where only a curious camera could find it. Lahars complicate and complete this picture by adding topography where there was none before and smoothing topography where it would have betrayed a structure to the ravinement. They are the masons of accident, choosing their own routes and, in doing so, making future beds for rivers, future shells for fields, and future panels for the sea to sculpt into itself. The geologist recognizes a Lahar signature in core and cut by its lack of sorting, its mix of class sizes carried in a matrix that hints at the viscosity of its day of travel, and sometimes by the subtle imbrication of large fragments that align like fish in a stream. The archaeologist recognizes a Laha's kindness when a surface below it is preserved so cleanly that even pollen grains seem to have waited, unbruised, for a microscope's searchlight to read them. Together they see what the slope intended when it let go, an archive built by urgency, a parish register of pebbles and dust that records a single procession with a fidelity no scribe could match. If a platform was caught in such a moment, Time's next editor would be diagenesis, the slow chemical conversation between buried grains and their new neighbors, a talk in which pore waters move dissolved ions into places where they can grow bonds. Ash can alter into clays that seal layers. Pumice can lose its airy innocence and become a denser, wiser stone. Carbonate can precipitate where water lingers, stitching a loose matrix into a crust that resists later fingers. These changes matter because they change the strength of the seal just in time for the sea to arrive in full and make its argument with waves. A well-lithified blanket will take insult money from the surf and still keep its contract with the surface beneath, letting only the edges show, a little like an old book whose spine has begun to reveal pages along its back while the text still holds within. Underwater, these layers lose none of their eloquence. A sub-bottom profiler sees a Laha as a thick, acoustically loud bed, sharply bounded above and below, and the ash as a thinner, continuous line that rings clear in long stretches. A core through such a sequence is a handshake between instruments and touch, the hard, crunchy middle that resists the rod's push, the powdery band that coats tools and fingers, the subtle smell of iron where diagenesis has turned the world a little more red between two stories. A sample from beneath a sealed surface, if it holds charcoal in situ or a soil horizon with root traces in place, becomes the kind of context that allows dates to mean what stories want them to mean without unfair asking. In these moments, the field and the lab give each other a gift, the proof that sequence exists and can be read, and the permission to use numbers in ways that hold when strangers come to read them. Beyond burial, volcanoes can create the very platforms that tempt interpretation. Lava flows that chill into a uniform surface do not need a mason to become a plaza, they need only time to level by their own cooling habits and the slight sag of gravity. A toe of basalt that rests against a ridge can harden into a step as true as any cut stone and keep that truth against years of modest weathering. Later, when the sea arrives and the tide scrubs it with limbs of motion instead of hands, the step will gleam in the camera as a temptation. The way back from temptation is texture. A dressed stone has a skin that remembers the direction of tools, a chilled flow has a skin that remembers the direction of crystallization and the contraction of cooling, a different kind of order that will, if given time and close light, show itself with a pride that does not match the language of chisel. Ash and water also build cements along old shorelines, producing beach rock, those tapes of coastal memory that capture the line where waves once spent themselves. Carbonate precipitates in the warm zone of the splash, stitching sand into sheets that later harden and lie flat. When sea level rises, those sheets go to sleep as a ladder of benches beneath new water, a staircase whose steps match pauses or pulses in the climb. A diver passing along such a system finds rectangles and ledges and angles that feel human until the long view reveals their repetition at scales and intervals tuned to sea level curves rather than to intention. Again, the remedy is not disdain but delight in how much geometry the earth gives away for free. The long memory of the region includes eruptions whose names have become more symbol than data, a blast from a caldera that put dust in skies far from here, a violent island that tore itself and the sea in a shared tantrum. Their relevance to this ridge is neither obvious nor absent. Tephra from such events might lie as thin counting lines in cores, letting a shelf's story borrow a date from a distant drama. Tsunami from a sudden collapse might push sand in sheets across the plain in patterns that a trained hand can distinguish from storm by the absence of burrowing between laminae and by the way clasts stack and fine toward the land. In both cases, the detail is the teacher. What counts is not that a famous mountain spoke, but that the echo in this exact place can be tied to a moment that also explains a change in context, a drowning, a burial, a pause that saved a line under a new script. Between events, quieter processes compose the long chorus that turns archives into artifacts. Compaction squeezes the water from clay-rich layers, lowering them by subtle millimeters that accumulate into centimeters as decades pass, depressing one corner of a surface more than another and introducing tilts that a careless viewer might mistake for design. Differential subsidence along fault softens plains into shallow bowls where once they were level, a transformation that a careful map can correct by rebuilding the now from the then in cross-sections that behave like time machines. Groundwater, enriched with dissolved ions from volcanic ash, precipitate cements that stain the world with colors that read like meaning but are only chemistry enjoying itself. Each of these shifts can mimic a hand's intention. Each of them can be parsed with the right pair of questions and the right companionship between field and lab. Biology is the last editor, and it is kind if treated with respect. Corals colonize edges that remain still and clear in enough light, creating frameworks that later become limestone and then relief, complicating the scene by building their own architecture on any surface worth the trouble. Calcareous algae paint plains with thin crusts that give a false gloss to faces that were in fact rough when air still touched them. Worms chisel tubes into everything, and their galleries make a lace that looks like ornament and is only hunger made visible. These additions are not noise, they are clocks of their own, their growth rates and patterns recording the interval since the sea arrived and fixed its residence. A coral head at a platform's shoulder has a birthday. A microbial mat's thickness speaks of seasons. Their presence and their health can tell where currents are strong or weak, where sediment stays or moves, where a line is likely to persist as a camera target and where it is likely to hide tomorrow under a new fall of silt. The shelf, then, becomes a palimpsest with a rubric. Find sharp contacts that argue for event, find planar faces that argue for preparation, find sealing layers that argue for preservation, find biological clocks that argue for time since drowning, and find alignments that argue for agreement rather than coincidence. Now ask whether fire offered the seal and whether water offered the hiding place. If the answers keep circling back to yes in small ways that add up, the big yes waiting under the question of an extension from the hill can be allowed to approach without theatrics. If the answers lean toward the Earth's own appetite for order, the stepwise shorelines that carbonate built, the steps of columnar basalt softened by silt, the benches cut by currents and scrubbed by storms, then the mind can relax into a different wonder, grateful that the world supplies illusions so generous that only good methods can love them without being fooled. In practical hours, this turns into a choreography that we already dance, scan for straightness that survives perspective, listen for buried planes beneath thin drapes, touch corners until their honesty declares itself, and core into contacts until one story refuses to be rewritten by another. On the boat, samples taken from beneath a suspiciously even face are set beside ash shards that glitter under a microscope and coral fragments that carry their ages like small suns captured in mineral calendars. On land, the hill's own layers are walked again, looking for siblings to the signatures found offshore, a baked line beneath an ash cap that matches the chemistry of tiny glass on the shelf, a lahar bed that holds the same coarse rhythm as a reflector heard just under sand at a depth that would make sense if the shoreline advanced in a particular century. The beauty of this dance is not that it must end in a single pose, but that its steps, if repeated with discipline, make every outcome graceful. For the audience that listens to sleep, there is comfort in this. The film does not need to hurry toward a verdict to earn its place in the quiet. It needs to show that sequence and patience are capable of carrying a myth through a sieve into a story. If fire buried a terrace and the sea tucked it away, the proof will be a series of small, precise kindnesses, a contact that bakes, a bed that sorts, a face that holds, a clock that agrees. If those kindnesses refuse to cluster where the imagination first wished, then the kindness remains toward truth, toward method, toward a shelf that kept its promises to geology even when it could not accommodate a legend. Both endings are intellectual lullabies. Both teach that attention is a form of care, and that care is what lets a human voice talk about 20,000 years and mean not a boast but a measurement earned under the eyes of a patient world. When the engines drop to their lowest murmur and the ship leans into a gentle swell that feels like breathing, the ridge lies beneath with the same composure it carried when the plain was dry, when a lahar poured, when ash sifted down, when the sea arrived, when corals grew, when sand moved, when the camera came. The continuity is the lesson. No single agent made this archive. Fire wrote chapters and then sealed them. Water erased and then preserved. Life covered and then dated. Stone cooled into shapes that humans admire and sometimes imitate, and humans arranged those shapes where the earth invited them to last. In that weave, a terrace might have been saved for us to find. In that weave, even if no hand ever set a stone here, the pattern is still worth reading aloud at a pace that lets sleep and thought walk together without tripping. Tomorrow we'll ask for trenches, for more cores, for samples wrapped with the slow care of people who will not be present when the numbers are born in a lab's quiet light. It will ask for maps to be updated with small corrections and for anomalies to be revisited when the tide and the wind are feeling generous. It will ask for permissions from offices on land and for conversations with fishers who have their own maps that sometimes include the word stones in places our instruments also like. It will ask, again and again, for the same fidelity to sequence that fire and water themselves have shown. And in the asking, the story will remain whole, whether it is ultimately told as an extension of a staircase asleep under green water or as a chapter about how islands make illusions and, with equal grace, make the methods that can tell illusion from evidence. In the soft interval before sleep takes everything into its own shelf of shallow dreams, consider one last image. A lahar pours at evening, its front dark and turbulent, its wake laying down into a quiet, steaming field that glows as it cools. In some corner of that field, a line of stones lies now beneath a fresh skin, their alignment held, their edges protected, their story postponed. Nights pass. Rains carve channels in the new surface and then stop. Seeds arrive, and a green stubble decides the plain's horizon again. Years collect. The sea begins to speak closer and closer and then speaks over that place entirely, laying a different grammar there. The stones do not mind the change of language. They wait with a competence that needs nothing from us except that we approach with the same composure they kept. If we do, they will either confess a plan or maintain a silence that is itself a kind of answer. Either way, the archive is intact. Either way, the world remains readable by those who bring time with them, which is, after all, the only passport the sea has ever asked to see. The expedition becomes a ritual the moment the plan stops being ink and turns into motion, and the ritual is built from patience rather than spectacle, from quiet redundancies rather than daring leaps, from a choreography of careful glances that, repeated enough times, begin to resemble understanding even before conclusions are earned. The ridge we have been following from the terraces inland into the shallow green of the Java Sea now dictates a simple creed that governs every watch and every shift change on deck. Prepare until surprise is rare, observe until patterns are dull, test until doubt is bored, and only then consider whether a line is more than a line and a corner more than an angle that water has been generous enough to keep for a while. Preparation begins ashore where screens glow in dim rooms and coffee cools more often than it is finished, where the drown plane is assembled from layers of public charts and private surveys and historical soundings that once guided trawlers more than scholars. The first mosaic of the shelf is stitched from multi-beam tiles harvested over years by ships passing on other errands, corrected for tides and heave and the subtle, seasonal tilt of the sea's own breathing, and what was once a map made for navigation starts to look like a relief model meant for choosing where to aim a camera. Over this relief, streams of arrows plot currents that change their minds with the monsoon, and thermal swaths visualize where water masses press and retreat through the season, because the best time to see a straight line is not only when light is kind but when the water has agreed to be still enough to let edges speak in full sentences instead of fragments. Permits and partnerships are not administrative burdens but foundations. They decide whether knowledge lives in a community or merely visits it on weekends. Fishers unfold their own maps on wooden tables scratched by years and weather, tapping places where nets found stones or where a color on the sea looks different after a storm, and those taps become pencil marks on our chart with a quiet authority that no satellite can grant. Letters to agencies are written with a humility that reflects the scale of the ask, and replies arrive with conditions that improve the plan rather than hobble it, seasons to avoid, channels to respect, habitats to leave entirely alone. The expedition roster fills with names that belong to the place as well as to the instruments, and the promise is made aloud in the briefing room and later repeated on deck. Nothing is taken that cannot be justified in the calm light of a later day, and everything taken is shared in ways that invite second and third readings by eyes not present when the sample left the water. Mobilization turns the ship into an instrument that can play the shelf without striking it. Motion sensors are bolted to a frame that knows the language of pitch and roll and heave, and they are taught to speak to the sonars in a dialect that allows geometry to stand still on the screen even when the deck refuses to for hours at a time. A sound velocity profiler is lowered into the water until it reads the column like a composer reading a score, correcting for the way pressure and temperature and salt bend the path of a ping, because a straight line on the screen should earn its straightness by physics and not by wish. Tides are not guesses. A tide gauge on a mooring near the ridge counts water height like a patient librarian, while RTK-corrected positions from satellites nail the ship to coordinates in the precise way that lets two passes drawn hours apart sit over each other with the confidence of tracing paper laid on a draft. On the first fair day, the pilot grid begins with multi-beam lanes spaced to leave no gaps wider than a modest mistake and overlapped by at least a generous hand so that edges can be stitched without making seams obvious. The operator whispers a cadence under breath: lane, turn, settle, lane, turn, settle, and the screen blooms with shaded relief where benches grow crisp and gullies grow dark. We test ourselves early with a patch test, a small, ritual rectangle flown in different headings that reveals the tiny misalignments between sensor and ship, and we adjust the numbers until the same corner appears in the same place no matter how the bow approaches it. Only then does the map become more than a sketch, only then do the shadows on the ridge become trustworthy enough to guide the next instrument that cares less about height and more about texture. Sidescan sonar follows like a painter with a different brush, laying tone across the relief to reveal rough and smooth, scatter and silence, a world where sand becomes velvet and rock becomes grit. We fly the fish at altitudes that give the right swath width without smearing detail, varying headings so that any feature that owes its existence to the sensor's favorite viewing angle loses our favor, while features that keep their identity even when we circle them once, twice, then pass along a track offset by a careful meter, grow in credibility with each repetition. The mosaic is assembled on the fly and then rebuilt each night from raw lines with filters that are confessed in the log, not hidden, so that those who come later will know what we did to make the sea look so legible without suspecting that we asked it to sing a tune it did not actually sing. Sub-bottom profiles speak more softly than side scan, their chirp-finding layers beneath the first smooth skin, and at the ridge they become the language we lean toward when a surface is too perfect to trust on sight. Buried planes reveal themselves as parallel reflectors that run long and level beneath drapes of sand more chaotic in their own handwriting. Sharp contacts declare events that can become brackets later when the cores tell their part of the same story. Where we see a planar reflector sit just below a flat face in the relief, we place a cautious pin on the map and a note that says not promise but question, the most honest word we know in a field that must resist declaring good news until it has survived the worst of our attentions. Targets are scored, not loved. A small team in the cabin writes a rubric on the whiteboard that gives points not for beauty but for persistence, straightness kept under rotation, planarity kept beyond the habit of cooling joints, orthogonality that resists the casual bias of perspective, context that makes sense in relation to currents, depth, and the ridge's own grain, and the company each target keeps because one suspicious plane alone is less convincing than a family of related features arranged like cousins across a space at intervals that do not belong to dunes or to idle geology. Targets fall into three baskets with letters no one says aloud with triumph, because letters are a device to arrange time, not a judgment on what the sea owes us. AS will see an eye first, BS will wait until tide and weather are friendly, CS will be revisited after the first round of cores tells us which parts of the story are sleeping under thin blankets and which are buried under lifetimes of drift. ROV checks begin at slack water when the ridge is least inclined to brush the camera with its skirts of moving silt, and the deck becomes a room with two centers of gravity, the pilot's hands and the tender's attention to the tether, which is the ROV's lifeline and also a line invited to tangle with anything that resents being approached. The video feed is tuned to flat color first, then to carefully increased contrast as the bottom comes into view, because more contrast can suggest detail that is not really there if added too eagerly. Lamps are feathered, not blazed, the light shaped as a soft cone with wet edges to avoid turning every floating grain into a snowstorm on screen. A scale bar with alternating colors enters frame when needed and then withdraws, a metronome in centimeters that keeps our sense of size honest when the eye wants a small corner to be monumental and a long edge to be trivial. Where a face holds flatness beyond a meter and a corner holds 90 degrees beyond a glance, we slow down and practice a ritual that viewers can learn and then perform with us in their minds. Frame the plane, hold the position, pivot a few degrees, frame again, trace the seam with the manipulator's finger, press lightly and feel whether grain states its direction or yields like mortar might. Then back off and show the context to avoid falling in love with a small square of truth that could be a charm on a larger necklace of misread stones. Photogrammetry sequences are flown even in this green light, slower than slow, the camera moving in arcs that allow a later software to stitch points into a model that will outlast the memory of a single watch and a single tide, so that we can later turn a surface on a screen and ask it again whether it really is as flat as we believed it to be when the CS skin was between us and patience. Divers enter only where the reef is absent and the bottom is forgiving, only when the thrumming of propellers would do more harm than the good their fins can earn, and they carry nothing that cannot be held in the mind as easily as in the hand. Their checklists feel like prayers, lines clear, knives where they should be, comms checked, turns rehearsed, ascent and descent tied to a clock that respects each person's margin more than any target's appeal. In the water, their breathing becomes the film's pulse, a slow exhale that counts time as attention rather than as distance. Gloved fingers touch edges to confirm what the ROV felt with plastic, and where taking a fragment would damage the story more than tell it, they leave the stone in peace and let the camera do the work. Where a scrape reveals a fresh surface that can tell texture more honestly, a thumbnail does the job that a chisel would do too loudly, because even truth has manners when it is delivered to a lens. Sampling is choreography inside choreography, a sequence of motions that should be unremarkable in their orderliness. Push cores sink into silt at the base of flat faces with a twist and a steadiness that avoids stirring the clock they are meant to read. Vibracores are deployed where the sub-bottom suggests an older surface just below reach, their hum more a purr than a saw, their tubes careful to enter and exit as vertical as waves allow. Every core gets its portrait, a passport photo on the seafloor and then another on deck before it is opened, with a ruler in frame and a slate showing time and place and depth, a small ritual that spares us later from uncertainty about which story belongs to which sample. When a chip is taken from a stone edge, the break is documented from several angles so that what is lost in small area can be repaid in a larger clarity, and the chip is bagged with a label that later hands will read with the gratitude that comes when memory is made trustworthy by modest effort. The wet lab on board is more bench than lab, but the work it holds is enough to keep the timeline honest until shore-based instruments can take over. Cores are split and described by the same words that described them in thought before we had the privilege to see them: fines and sands and gravels, laminations and massive beds, sharp contacts and gradational fades, oxidation streaks and faint ash lines that shimmer like fine sugar. Smear slides answer the simplest question: what is this made of, while grain size sieved count the mixture in percentages that tell of energy and quiet, of storms and pauses. Magnetic susceptibility meters run along the surface like small trains, finding the tracks where ash or baked horizons tell fire's part without drama. A handheld XRF gun speaks in elements, rough but sufficient to let volcanic layers distinguish themselves by their chemistry even before a microprobe later writes exact balances in patient digits. The shore labs each hold a piece of time's keyring. Radiocarbon work waits in rooms lit dimly enough to respect OSL's need for darkness, and OSL sampling is done in tubes that keep the last lighter grain source sealed until analysis unseals it under a method that can declare, with the appropriate circumspection, when that grain last lay in the sun before being covered by a flaw or by a fall. Coral fragments travel wrapped and padded to places where uranium and thorium ratios can translate growth into years, and tephra travels in glass vials toward microscopes that will read magmas the way a musician reads a line of notes, saying this shard belongs to that eruption, and if that eruption is known from far-flung records, then the shelf and the hill and other archives can all tell the same minute in the same language for once. Quality assurance is the softest part of the story to tell and the most important part to perform. Blind splits of sediments are sent to 2 labs, not to test the labs but to test ourselves for how easily we fall in love with a single result. Pre-registration of hypotheses looks like bureaucracy at first and then reveals itself to be a kindness toward the mind that knows it can find a pattern wherever it is allowed too much freedom. data is stored with the kind of redundancy that makes an archivist smile. Local copies and mirrored servers and hard drives in cases with shock indicators that tell whether they were mishandled on the way home, because a lost sample is not only a lost number, it is a lost day of weather, a lost hour of slack tide, a lost handshake with the person who held the tether and watched the line on the screen with more concentration than will be visible in any final cut. Openness becomes practice while work is still in progress, not a virtue exercised at the end when the story looks tidy. Raw sonar lines, once corrected for tides and motion, are queued for a repository with metadata clean enough that a stranger with the right software can retrace our stitches, replicate our mosaics, challenge a target pick, and perhaps suggest another we missed because our eyes were tired or our time was narrowed by a schedule that waves were not interested in honoring. A small set of targets is published as coordinates with caveats, inviting other boats with other sensors to see whether features persist across instruments, because nothing makes a line more honest than surviving 2 different pings on 2 different days with 2 different crews who did not plan to agree. In the narrative that watches over all of this, sound carries as much truth as image. The engine's low heartbeat becomes the metronome of method. The slight crackle of a radio at the edge of hearing reassures more than it distracts. The faint hiss of diver's breath marks the length of a shot as a promise to linger long enough for a viewer to share an inspection rather than being told the result by a voice that would only be repeating what the eyes have just learned. A hydrophone dips now and then to record the shelf's own music, shrimp, distant engines, the longing groan of a rope under strain, and these notes lay beneath a narration that does not rise and fall with the false urgency of a chase but with the honest attention of a vigil. Ethics do not appear as a sidebar but are woven into practice. A prop guard keeps a turtle that we did not see at first from becoming the price of our curiosity. Thruster diffusers on the ROV reduce the scouring on a silt face so that what we record is not what we made. Anchors are set only where sand is deep and forgiving, and often a dynamic positioner keeps the ship hovering instead, because convenience is not permission. When a fragment is taken, a note is left with a local partner and a plan is made for a small exhibit in a nearby museum or school so that the story can become a thing that lives in the community's memory as more than an interruption in a fishing ground or a line on a government form. Logistics are told plainly because truth has logistics. Weather windows are not metaphors. They are rectangles on a calendar colored by monsoon and by the less predictable humors of the intertropical sky. Spare parts are not footnotes, they are actors who save scenes when an O-ring decides it has had a long enough life at sea. Redundancy is not caution, it is competence, and so there are 2 ways to measure depth, 2 ways to mark a position, 2 ways to bring an ROV home if a thruster sulks or a tether decides it prefers the bottom to the deck. In a film meant to soothe, these details calm more than they clutter, because they whisper that the story's pace is protected from the common mishaps that topple ladders built of higher drama and lower preparation. As the grid over the ridge fills in, as AS and BS and CS become names attached to coordinates and notes attached to names, as cores line up like a row of pale candles labeled in careful hands, a kind of quiet confidence grows that is not the same thing as hope. Confidence, here, means that we have done enough looking that a straight line is now less likely to be a coincidence than it would have been yesterday, that we have done enough sampling that a number attached to a layer is less likely to be orphaned from its proper surface than it would have been last week, that we have invited enough ears and eyes into the process that a conclusion will either already have companions the moment it steps out into the light or will be gently sent back to the instruments if it tries to sprint ahead of its feet. There is room in this phase for the imagination to stretch without being asked to bear weight. The ridge could hold a walkway that once linked terraces on land to platforms that greeted a coast long moved inland, and if it does, the film will kneel to that fact with the grace of a guest who knows whose house he is standing in. The ridge could hold a perfect arrangement of geology that makes a story unnecessary and a method beautiful, and if it does, the film will kneel to that also, because the point was never to win an argument with the sea but to learn a way to listen that a person could carry to other shelves, other hills, other nights when claims and counterclaims move through rooms faster than data can follow them. Before sleep slips over the deck like a quiet fog, the plan for dawn is read aloud in few words that protect the crew from ambiguity and the story from accident. Begin at waypoint 7 for a photogrammetry reshoot at slack high. Lay a vibracore on the southern edge of the planar reflector that sub-bottom calls at 2.1 meters below seafloor. Revisit the corridor that became less convincing at low angle but kept its width in the flood when glare softened the frame. Leave a marker buoy only if the current is gentle enough to keep it near its anchor. Sample no coral on the western lip. The colony there is building a very patient staircase of its own and needs no interruption from ours. Send the day's clean lines ashore as soon as they are stitched, and send the roar along with them, because trust is a tide that rises as slowly as sea level and recedes faster than a squall can teach humility to a plan. In this way the journey becomes its own argument, not for any single conclusion but for a standard by which conclusions can be expected to enter the world without stumbling. The hill inland gave us a way to recognize flatness and courage without names carved into stone. The fire chapter taught us to recognize ceiling and sequence without romance. The nights over the ridge are teaching us to recognize persistence under rotation and honesty under light. When the film turns, as it soon must, toward the rooms where debates gather their instruments and voices, it will carry this method as a kind of amulet, a small bright thing that is neither an answer nor a shield, but a reminder that attention, performed well and shared without vanity, is the only architecture that never has to be dug out from under ash or lifted from under tide. The debate does not begin in a courtroom or a stadium but in the quiet rooms where screens glow and someone reads an email twice before replying once, in the soft-lit halls of conferences where poster boards lean and coffee cools untouched, in the drawn-out cadence of a peer review that arrives like weather and departs like a season, leaving behind small drifts of suggestion and the occasional hard ice of rejection that may or may not be fair, and even when fair, may or may not feel like it in the tender hours after midnight when a claim about ancient terraces and a submerged extension is still new enough to shake the furniture in any mind that holds it for a while and wonders what it would mean if it survived the crossing from idea to evidence to endurance. Claims walk into these rooms wearing numbers and metaphors and sometimes the music of a place, and they are received by cultures that want two things at the same time, to be surprised and to be certain, a pairing as difficult as keeping the boat steady while turning to look at a shadow that might be a corner or a coincidence. The rituals of certainty are far older than any single site. They are the methods that carried fragile truths across centuries of distraction. They ask, gently but relentlessly, for a chain that does not break, data shared in a form that colleagues can use without favors, methods spelled out in a grammar that others can trace without translation, samples archived so that later hands can test the same materials and reach either the same conclusion or not, and either way, be respected for trying. When those rituals work, astonishments are earned. When they are rushed, even a good idea can become a firework that leaves a smell behind but not much to sweep up in the morning. The phrase academic suppression appears in these conversations the way fog appears on water after a hot day, rolling in low and even, softening outlines and making distances deceptive. Some use it to name the friction felt when a large claim meets a narrow door. Others use it as a lament for the slow pace of review in a world that rewards speed and spectacle. A few use it as a shield against criticism that is simply doing its job. The truth that helps most at sea helps here as well. Many things can be true at once, and the story improves when they are held together without making a villain where an institution or a person is only being ordinary, and without making a saint where charisma is standing in for patience. Gatekeeping exists, and so does quality control. Bias exists, and so does rigor. The line between resistance to novelty and defense of standards wins like a pale contour on a bathymetric map, and it moves in small ways year by year as disciplines learn to welcome instruments they did not grow up with and questions they did not plan to answer when they first set up their benches and their committees. What happens to a claim about very old terraces and a possible underwater extension when it enters this weather is neither dramatic nor trivial. It is refereed. A manuscript arrives with images and dates and geophysics, and it is sent to a handful of readers who agree to read it as carefully as they would want their own work read on a difficult day. Some do. Some cut corners. Some demand impossible proofs, and some offer the gift of precise, modest requests that draw the authors closer to the ground that will carry them into the next submission with stronger legs. Sometimes the paper is declined with a road map attached, a list of fixes that, if completed, will make the next try less painful. Sometimes it is accepted with changes that make it less exciting and more robust, a trade that the future of the idea will thank the present for making. And sometimes, rarely and noisily, it is published in a form that later proves too fragile to bear the traffic that follows, and a correction or a retraction is issued, and the tone of the discourse shifts for a while toward caricature before settling again into the quieter business of building or dismantling claims one layer of method at a time. In this phase, the incentives of the outside world matter in ways that are easy to underestimate. Attention is not distributed evenly. The number 20,000 glows hotter than 2,000, and pyramid travels faster than terrace, and under the sea is a current in itself. Editors know this. Producers know this. Algorithms know this without knowing anything else. A headline hurries. A thread collects praise and derision in equal measure. A clip of a sonar screen gathers views that have very little to do with the sonar and very much to do with the human appetite for a story that reframes origins. Meanwhile, the data that would actually carry the claim past that appetite into the durable rooms where answers live are still being cleaned, and the cores are still being measured, and the lab reports are not back, and the tide has been uncooperative for a week. The dissonance is not anyone's fault, it is a property of modern attention. The remedy is to align incentives where possible, to make it easier to be precise than to be loud, and to reward the publication of raw materials and careful protocols as much as the publication of a finished argument, so that those who would rather be rigorous are not punished by the economy of clicks for being slower than those who would rather be spectacular. The plan for avoiding the worst outcomes is not new, but it benefits from being said aloud in a film that takes sleep seriously. Pre-register the main hypotheses so that the tests to be applied are chosen before the data's temptations begin their soft work. Commit to a subset of targets for confirmatory analysis and reserve others for exploratory work, so that not every line on a map is an opportunity for the mind to congratulate itself for noticing a pattern that exists only because it was so thoroughly sought. Invite a red team to critique the pipeline before results are announced, giving colleagues who disagree with the premise the formal role of finding the holes, not as adversaries but as collaborators whose success will either strengthen the claim or save everyone time. Split samples across labs so that a number S home is not a single machine with a single operator. Publish the processing code along with the process data and the raw, so that the path from ping to picture can be retraced like a ship's wake on a calm day. Consider registered reports that commit a journal to publishing the study regardless of outcome, so that a careful negative does not disappear into a drawer labeled not useful, when it might be the most useful contribution a crowded topic could receive this year. Behind these technical hedges lies the social architecture that carries or breaks trust. Authorship that reflects contribution rather than hierarchy builds goodwill, and it keeps the conversation about evidence instead of about who was left off a list. Data sharing agreements that treat local institutions as equal partners rather than sources of permits build a foundation on which long projects can grow without fear of sudden fences thrown up by resentment or fatigue. Benefit sharing that returns samples, creates exhibitions, funds training, and acknowledges indigenous or local knowledge creates a circle in which finding a terrace under the sea is not a foreign event but a community event, not a trophy but a story that belongs where it was found. There will be moments when none of this seems to matter to those who are angry, and it helps to recognize that anger often travels with grief and with hope. Those who have given time and reputation to unpopular ideas tire of the same criticisms delivered without reading, and they respond with phrases like suppression because the where is real even when the conspiracy is not. Those who have tended the tools of a discipline for decades tire of watching methods mangled in the public square and respond with words like pseudoscience even when the proposal in question is 100 meters shy of that cliff. Those who live near the sites tire of being asked to host the world's dreams without the world offering to help repair a broken PA or replace a net, and they respond with suspicion that is rational even when the visitor cannot personally make amends for every prior slight. The film can help by allowing all three to breathe without naming villains, and by showing methods, not arguments, so that viewers can see where friction comes from and where it dissolves in the presence of simple, good work. On board, the debate takes on a different tone. A diver returns with footage of a face that keeps its planarity well beyond the comfort zone of basalt, and the pilot and the mapper disagree in the friendliest way possible about whether the corner is as honest as it looks. The log notes both impressions and adds measurements to cool the conversation, and the plan suggests a second pass when the sun is higher so that the haze at the edge of the frame will reveal less and hide less in equal measure. An email arrives with a suggestion to change the sub-bottom-S frequency sweep to better resolve a thin reflector seen yesterday, and the technician adjusts the settings and writes the change into a manifest that travels with the day's file so that a later analyst will not be blamed for a change she did not make. None of this feels like suppression or theater. It feels like the slow accumulation of trust that allows a sentence like "we think we found something" to enter the world without requiring either a fanfare or an apology. On shore, the conferences that act as a nervous system for this world are neither trials nor festivals. They are rooms with posters and chairs, with arcs of talk that last 15 minutes and then end with questions that can be kinder than they sound and sharper than they appear. A talk about terraces and extensions underwater is given on a Tuesday afternoon in a session about submerged landscapes and sea level rise. The presenter shows a map that has been simplified by necessity and a model that has been simplified by mercy, because no one in any room will follow a pipeline end to end in real time, and the good rule is to show the 3 critical steps where error most easily enters and to be ready with longer answers over coffee for those who have time to ask and the patience to listen. In one corner of the hall, a small knot of geophysicists leans over a printout and points at a band of reflectors that, they agree, could be many things but cannot be dismissed as noise. In another corner, A trio of archaeologists wonders about the absence of small finds that would make habitation feel less like an assumption and more like a neighbor within reach. No decisions are made in either corner. A few collaborations are born. A few minds shift a degree toward open, or closed, or simply toward not yet. Corrections and retractions deserve their own quiet, because they do not belong to shame. When a claim is scaled back, the writer should be allowed to say so without the fire of mockery, because doing so is part of the very sequence that keeps the system sane. When a paper is withdrawn because a layer was misinterpreted or a sample contaminated or a chain of custody too slender to carry the weight of a large age, the better story is not that of a mistake punished, but of a process that worked well enough to save future time and future energy for better uses. The book of the shelf is long. Saving a chapter from error is an act of care that benefits readers not yet born and writers not yet writing. Funding sits quietly beside all of this and tilts the table with subtle pressure. Projects that promise flash often secure large sums quickly. Projects that promise infrastructure and calibration and archives grow more slowly. The solution, hinted at by many and enacted by a patient few, is to build portfolios that include both, to ask for resources that fund the slow backbones of shared tools and data while allowing room for the careful pursuit of anomalies that might, if they survive, reshape the operating picture. Registered repositories, core facilities, open curricula for methods, long-lived moorings and gauges and sensors. These do not draw headlines, but they draw down the cost of future astonishment so that when one arrives it can be weighed on a scale everyone trusts rather than appraised in a marketplace that few admit to liking and many are forced to use. If the claim of a very old terrace and its seaward echo survives this weather for long enough to leave a dent in consensus, it will do so not because those who first made it shouted louder or had cleaner graphics, but because they learned to ask for the tests that would hurt the most if they failed and help the most if they passed. It will do so because they shared their data and their mistakes and their changes of mind. It will do so because others who began as skeptics became co-authors in the slow work of turning a maybe into a likely, and because those who began as advocates permitted their own claims to be trimmed until what remained, though smaller, could carry weight for a long distance without sagging. It will do so because the communities closest to the sea felt seen and heard and included in the benefits, and because the story that traveled back to them was not in a language they had to borrow for the evening but in the shared grammar of a place whose winds and seasons they have known longer than any expedition has existed. There is a kind of silence in which accusations thrive, and it is the silence of missing materials. When data are kept private out of habit rather than necessity, suspicion grows like algae over corners. When methods are described broadly enough to protect reputations but not narrowly enough to protect replications, a fog rolls in that does not clear quickly. The shelf does not tolerate fog in the mind any more than the bridge tolerates it in the dawn. The remedy is to make openness a default and secrecy a justified, temporary exception, to make version control and lab notebooks and data dictionaries part of the romance rather than a punishment after the fact. In a film, this looks like shots of drives being mirrored and checksums being compared, which sounds like a recipe for boredom and turns out to be comforting, because it reveals the spine of a careful enterprise and frees the viewer from having to imagine that a revelation is being protected more fiercely than the truth. The fear that hovers over the better spirits on both sides of any lively controversy is not that the other side will win but that the topic will be discredited by excess on either bank. The advocate worries that overstatement will remove the oxygen from the room when a sober case might have been made if the tone had stayed modest. The skeptic worries that scorn will galvanize a movement around a banner of grievance that lasts longer than it deserves and distracts from better questions. The only cure is etiquette married to method. Do not call names. Do not promise what the data cannot practically deliver. Do not decorate uncertainty with adjectives until it looks like a conclusion. Do not hide uncertainty under confidence until it looks like a lie. Do not ask to be believed. Ask to be tested, and commit to being interested in the result even if it does not match the draft written in the heart before the work began. Back on deck, the sun has swung low enough to turn the ship's wake into a long, luminous sentence that fades slowly back into green. The ridge lies where it lay yesterday and will lie tomorrow, unconcerned with how anyone names what lies upon it. The crew has their small rituals, a last loop through the targets that can be reached before slack ends, a careful wash of the sampling gear so that tomorrow's samples are not haunted by today's, a pause at the rail where the current writes its minute-by-minute glyphs on the surface and the mind calms enough to remember that this, too, is part of the work. In the cabins, messages are written to colleagues on land in tones that aim for unexcitability. Here is a face that held, here is a corner that persisted, here is an ash line that matched the chemistry we guessed, here is a Laher contact that looks clean enough to bracket a drowning, here are two things that looked promising and did not survive touch, here is everything we changed since last week so that any future agreement is not accidental. The most generous thing a project like this can do for its viewers, and for those who will work in its wake, is to normalize the pace at which hard things become reliable. Show how long it takes. Show how often a rectangle turns into a ramp. Show how often a number returns with a wider uncertainty than anyone wished and how that uncertainty is not a failure but a property, a graceful one, of materials that know how to keep secrets unless asked in exactly the right way. Show how many hands are needed to keep an ROV tether out of trouble and a call log precise. Show how an argument becomes a community of practice, not a tribe and a counter-tribe, and how that community can hold mutually exclusive possibilities for a while without panic, because the instruments will keep humming and the ridge will keep lying there and the tide will keep opening windows and the people who love this work will keep asking for a proof that is not passionate but careful. If the film must say anything close to an instruction as the night lengthens and the chapter near its end, let it be an invitation to try this etiquette on other controversies, not because all claims are alike, but because the way to hold them is. Put method ahead of myth without scolding. Put patience ahead of personality without punishing charisma. Put benefit ahead of brand so that places feel served rather than used. Put replication ahead of revelation so that an idea that does not survive love can still leave behind a narrower, stronger truth. And when the word suppression is whispered into a room where the air is already tense, ask first whether what is being felt is the weight of standards or the pinch of a gate, and then let the answer be a plan rather than a grievance, a list of missing pieces that can be delivered in time rather than a list of villains that can never be satisfied. The sea forgives almost everything except arrogance. It is indulgent with error if the error admits itself and learns too quickly for damage to gather. It is patient with slowness if slowness is the price of care. It grows rough without apology when speed, or pride, tries to outrun weather. The ridge is an altar to this temperament. It rewards persistence without drama. It punishes shortcuts invisibly, by giving you exactly what you asked for in a form you cannot defend later in a room where the lights are bright and the questions are good and the clock is gentle and precise and has no stake in any outcome. The film's promise, made in the first sentences and kept here, is to go to those rooms after the sea, to carry the story without dressing it up and without shrinking it, to let the argument about old terraces and drowned platforms be as large as it deserves to be and no larger, as small as the evidence requires and no smaller, and to leave the viewer, and the colleagues, and the place itself, with more room to breathe and more reason to trust the next hard thing that asks for attention. Night work like this asks to be carried into the senses with care, so that the story arrives not as an argument but as an atmosphere, not as a demand but as a permission to rest while attention stays softly awake, and the architecture of that feeling begins with a voice that measures itself against the rhythm of breath and tide and moves at a pace that the sea itself might keep if it chose to speak. The voice sits close but not intimate, warm in the middle range where baritone and low alto feel like lantern light, slow enough to leave space between phrases, clear enough to thread intricate ideas without waking startle, with consonants rounded and sibilants tamed so that nothing hisses or snaps in the midnight air. Each sentence leans into a small inhalation and a longer exhalation, and the room around the voice is kept alive with just enough air to be believable, a faint room tone that keeps silence from feeling like a void and helps the listener's thoughts float rather than fall. Compression is gentle, no more than what is needed to keep peaks from pinching and whispers from disappearing, and it never irons out the microdynamics that give words their living shape, because the aim is not flatness but calmness, not monotony but steadiness. Under the voice, a low landscape of sound spreads like a tide at neap, slow and wide, in tones that never crowd the center, that sit off to the sides with the patience of distant weather. Harmonies choose modes that feel like moonlight rather than sunlight, D minor or G Dorian, colors that carry curiosity without ache, with drones that do not insist on resolving because the story is not about arriving but about abiding. The harmonic rhythm is barely a rhythm at all, a slow turning of a planet rather than a clock, and the texture thins whenever the voice leans into a thought that requires a listener's internal picture to become detailed. String pads breathe beneath the floorboards, cellos and violas without bow scrapes, filtered until the grain becomes velvet, joined occasionally by a single bell tone that arrives like a star at intervals long enough to feel like a visitor rather than a pattern, and that bell never repeats precisely, because repetition is a kind of gravity that pulls attention into counting when what is needed is drifting. The sea is present even when it is not literal, carried by a band of low frequencies that rise and fall so slowly it takes minutes to notice, a repeating gesture just below perception that helps the body map itself to something larger than a room. At the edges of the stereo field, small details glint and fade, the faintest trace of propeller wash far off as if from another boat on another night, a soft shuffle of deck rope that might be the mind's own imagination, the subtle crackle of shrimp recorded once with a hydrophone and now filtered until it sounds more like a campfire underwater than like an alarm. When the camera descends, the mix descends with it, high frequencies rolling off as if light itself were filtering through meters of green, the world becoming more intimate and less busy, the sense of distance tightened so that the listener feels securely enclosed, a capsule rather than a stage. The optics of rest require light to arrive as if it had breathed before it reached the screen, so grading favors a palette that accepts darkness as a color rather than a lack, blacks not crushed but dimensional, greens and teals muted into the language of dusk. Contrast stays gentle, the brightest whites rarely touching the upper limit so that there are no sudden edges to catch on, and saturation is modest enough that underwater algae does not shout and deck paint does not glare. On maps, colors are chosen as if the bathymetry were a painting hung in a quiet gallery, pale aquas deepening to navy with soft steps, lines, and text in a gray that reads clearly without asking the eyes to snap into focus, vector strokes rounded rather than razor-sharp so that nothing cuts the gaze into fragments. When numbers appear, they appear as if whispered small, unintrusive, living for enough seconds that the slow reader is not punished, then dissolving into the scene without a flourish as if they had always been part of the water. Editorial rhythm learns from the ridge itself, asking every cut to justify its speed. Shots enjoy long lives, 12 seconds when there is much to see, 20 when the seeing is a matter of mood, and 30 when the sound is carrying the weight and the picture only needs to keep faith. Crossfades are not merely transitions but tides, a second of overlap in which the world changes its mind so slowly that the eyes never need to leap. When the story asks to place two ideas side by side, the picture does not fight the voice, it offers a slow split, two frames that breathe together for a moment and then return to one, so that comparison becomes companionship rather than contest. Titles are sparse and small, the typeface unpretentious and modern enough to read easily, letters spaced as if each one had room to rest, and they arrive on a soft fade from below as if they were lifting rather than landing. The sounds of tools, the ping of sonar, the hum of the winch, the fan of an equipment rack are kept but humbled, EQ'd to remove their bite so that their presence reassures without awakening, brought up only long enough to set a place and then allowed to sit under the voice as a low bed that says we are still here, and the work is still delicate. When the ROV sees something that holds its angle and the pilot's breath catches, the mix lets that breath be heard for a heartbeat and then folds it back into calm, a reminder that excitement can be noticed and then soothed, that the film's promise is not to banish wonder but to let it land without rattling furniture. And when debate enters the gentle argument between interpretation and caution, the score withdraws its color for a minute and leaves only the hull's hum and a whisper of water, so that thought can do its own harmonizing. Because the night can make small sound seem large, levels are managed like tides with long cycles, the integrated loudness living at a place where normal listening does not need adjustment, peaks held far below the threshold where a sudden vowel could be a wave slapping the pier. The voice is centered, the music wider, the ambience widest of all, so that space is felt without being shown. Reverberation is a memory more than a room, a tail long enough to soften but short enough to leave the consonants crisp. Each time the narrative moves below the surface, high-end shimmering is trimmed a little, as if eyes had adjusted and pupils had widened, and each time it rises to decks and maps, the top returns with a soft blue glint, the tonal equivalent of a breeze. The camera speaks slowly, its moves mostly the result of the sea itself, a mild sway that becomes the visual metronome, a drift that makes parallax feel like breath. When motion is needed, it is a nudge rather than a push, a slow dolly into a sonar mosaic as if the mind were leaning forward. Cuts away from the object of attention are earned by a phrase, never by a reflex, and the film practitioners who have made whole careers of clever speed are invited to allow their craft to be invisible, the virtuosity here being the restraint to let the world display itself at the tempo it chose before edits were invented. To keep attention at rest, the script avoids the spice of sudden questions and chooses instead the ease of statements that lead the listener not by force but by suggestion, each paragraph a stepping stone shallow enough that the water over it is still warm from the day. Arguments are framed as invitations, and the words perhaps and might are not hedges but baffles that remove the turbulence from ideas so that those ideas become eddies into which a mind can drift and circle rather than waves that crash against the skull. When numbers occur, they occur with rhythm 20 meters, then 30, then the shelf begins to forget itself so that even the arithmetic of the sea becomes a kind of lullaby. For those who will add a second language on screen, the captions are set low and quiet, in a type that friends the picture instead of competing with it, long enough to read without hurry, short enough never to become a wall of text, with line breaks chosen as if for breath. The color of the letters is not white but a soft gray, and a faint outer line gives them permission to sit over water without shivering. On maps, labels are not pinned to points but tucked into nooks, making language a texture rather than a decal. Every few minutes the film offers a tiny recession, a clearing where the voice steps back and only the water and the deck and a line of harmony remain, not for long, only for the length of a meditation bell that never rings. These moments are bridges between ideas and also spaces where the mind can fall forward into sleep without feeling that a sentence has been abandoned mid-flight. If the story arrives at an edge, an ash layer that seals a surface, a corner underwater that keeps its angle, the music will not celebrate, it will bow its head and grow thinner, a way of acknowledging that the hard parts of knowing are not moments for triumph but for lowering the volume so that the next small, difficult test can be heard. The film keeps faith with eyes that tire and ears that do not prefer surprises by avoiding the usual ornaments of documentary in daylight: no whoosh, no popping transitions, no ticking. Graphs unveil themselves with the grace of cloth being lifted, not the speed of blind snapping up. Numbers count up or down over seconds long enough for understanding to climb aboard. When the line between two times is drawn, it is drawn slowly, like a tide creeping over sand, so that the difference between before and after becomes a sense rather than a sudden fact. In longer canvases, an hour, too, the structure breathes in cycles that echo human sleep, arcs of 20 minutes that invite the mind to set down a thought and pick up a picture, then set down the picture and enter a sound, the changeovers smoothed so thoroughly that they can be missed consciously while still working at the level where the nervous system keeps its own counsel. The last 10 minutes lighten content to almost nothing, a recapitulation of water and a gliding over maps with no labels, the voice gentler and lower, the music solfeggio in the sense of solfa as breath and not in the sense of a promise, a place where the hard sentences about method and patience have already done their work and can rest while the listener does not need to rise to applaud. For creators who will record voices at home or in makeshift rooms near ports and piers, the care is practical and simple: a microphone that prefers the middle rather than the sparkle, set at a distance a hand's breadth away, aimed to avoid plosive winds, in a space that has rugs and soft walls so that no early reflection sours a vowel. The test phrase is always the same in spirit even if different in words: the sea at night is a patient archivist, repeated until the room learns how to hold it without adding its own opinions. Post-production treats the voice like a boat in a swell, leveling gently, never chopping off peaks with impatience, removing hiss without removing air, leaving the top a little darker so that sibilance does not act like moonlight on metal. Music is composed or selected with a vow never to trick. No sudden chord changes, no melodies the body will want to hum later when it ought to be sleeping, no bass that thumps at heart rate. If rhythm exists, it exists at the scale of weather, phrases that last 2 minutes and then mirror themselves without the listener needing to notice. Instruments favor the human without the human's breath, bowed strings without bow, wind pads without tying, pianos whose hammers have been wrapped in felt twice and then recorded from a room away so that the intimacy of human-made sound comes without the urgency that the sound of effort can bring. The CS own recordings are gifts that must be opened with etiquette. Hydrophone tracks are curated to favor curiosity over clatter, the shrimp chorus softened until it becomes shimmer, the distant engines filtered so that no harmonic draws attention like a mosquito. Above water surf is mixed to a pillow rather than a sheet, and it never pans sharply, because the ear will follow an edge in a way the mind cannot resist, and the film's design is to remove edges except where a stone face keeps one for reasons that the story earns. Graphics that show instrument sonar screens, sub-bottom plots become tapestries rather than blinking machines. Their refresh rates are slowed and their brightest dots tamed, trails of motion given a long tail so that shapes feel like memory rather than flicker. When a rectangle is outlined, the line draws itself as if with a pen on paper, not all at once with a snap, because the way a line appears teaches the eye how to feel about the line. If a coordinate must be shown, it arrives small, in the corner, and fades, and those who need it will pause and collect it, while those who do not will never be asked to attend to it at the cost of drifting. Even the business of the ship is treated like weather, scenery rather than spectacle. Crew voices are heard occasionally, low and clear, laughter soft and unforced, commands spoken as if the sea were listening and could be startled. The winch is unveiled in wide shots rather than close-ups of cable and hook, because scale helps the body relax, and scale is lost in detail the way the horizon is lost in fog. Meal times pass in a single shot of steam rising from a cup in a hand at the rail while water writes its ideograms on the surface and the voice rests. In the cut, moments of inquiry are placed where they will not make the heart mistake alertness for alarm. Questions appear after knowledge has been shared, not before, so that the mind is not hooked and held, and answers are framed as moods rather than verdicts, honest about uncertainty without the tone of a seminar. When the film must admit a misreading, a corner that proved joint, a wall that proved slab, the admission is shown, not told, the finger presses, the dust falls, the angle dissolves, and the voice simply names what happened and thanks the method for keeping everyone honest. Accessibility is care, not compromise. Subtitles appear by default in the language of the voice and in the language of the place, quietly, steady at the bottom and never rising into imagery except when maps are full. The color contrast is kept adequate for tired eyes, and the font size is chosen so that a viewer in the next room can read without leaning in, because the viewer in the next room is also part of the night's ecosystem and deserves not to be jarred. Peaks are kept low so that a person drifting off will not be woken by a sudden adjective given too much force, and the end is allowed to become an ambient tale that plays for minutes after the last sentence, because endings are opportunities for startles if they arrive too cleanly. The camera's visit to the hill is colored by morning and late afternoon rather than noon, the geometry of the terrace is shown with shadows that are long and thin, so that angles reveal themselves softly. No drone flies low enough to set leaves trembling. If aerial views are needed, they are slow and high, a cloud's eye rather than a dragonfly's dart. On land as at sea, the speed is the ethic, and speed is always guilty until proven necessary. When the narrative must carry a sequence of methods, mapping, scanning, diving, the picture binds them with repeated motifs so that the mind recognizes an old friend and walks with less effort, the same slow zoom into the bathymetric ridge each time, the same soft chime when a target marker is placed, the same brief silence before the ROV drops into the green. These repetitions do not signal formula, they signal safety, a promise that the next minutes will behave the way the last did, and that nothing will leap out of the dark. The credits look back rather than up, the names of people and places appearing over the water they worked on and the stone they touched, long enough to be read, gentle enough to feel like a continuation rather than a curtain call, and the final sound is not a chord but the hush of a hull at idle, the little noises that are the world forgiving the day's attention and inviting sleep to take what it needs. If a viewer wakes then and wonders whether there was a pyramid under the sea, the film will not have failed, because it was not made to answer in the night, it was made to ask in a way that allows the question to fall asleep and wake up later in better light. Across the whole, the discipline is to let the film be a place where rigor feels like comfort. The carefulness of level and color and pacing and phrasing is not a varnish but the wood itself, carrying the weight of respect for the ideas and the people and the waters. If a terrace sleeps beneath the Java Sea and the ridge truly holds a plan that hands once set in stone, this sound and image will greet it with a tone that tells the truth without raising the pulse. If the shelf holds only geology that is so beautiful it does not need a legend, this sound and image will greet that, too, with gratitude and the same quiet promise that the listening was careful, the looking was long, and the night was treated with the dignity it lends to any story that wishes to be remembered in the morning without having kept anyone from rest. Dawn approaches with the steady quiet of a tide turning, and the ship wears the night's salt like a soft memory, its decks drying in slow patches while the ridge below keeps its silence, unchanged by lights and lenses, untouched by the arguments that will later gather in bright rooms and ask for answers that the sea will only give at a pace suited to stone and time. The work has been a long vow kept in small axe lanes flown and stitched into maps that look like sleep seen from above, textures painted with sound until roughness and smoothness learned to speak, layers listened to beneath the sand until a buried edge sounded like a chord held just under hearing, and quiet drops into green where corners were approached as if greeting a shy neighbor, never rushing, never mistaking a first impression for a handshake. The promise made at the beginning: prepare until surprise is rare, observe until patterns are dull, test until doubt is bored has carried the hours without ornament, and now, in this last turn before the light takes the horizon back from the stars, the story understands itself well enough to end without urgency. No single verdict is owed to anyone, least of all to a sea that has sheltered both geology's precise mimicry and humanity's precise insistence for longer than any calendar designed in a lecture hall can bear. If an underwater terrace truly lies along this ridge, it has slept through ages of weather in a corridor of depth where storms do not scold and silt drifts like a veil, and it has agreed to reveal itself only to a method gentle enough to deserve it. If the shelf holds only forms that nature wrote in cool basalt and warm carbonate, and the way waves prefer to write lines across a platform that once was shore, then the discovery is not smaller, it is simply purer, a lesson in how much architecture the world gives away without a name attached. In both endings, patience has been the tool and grace the technique, and the film's first sentence, once a question asked into darkness, is now a room where the question can sit without being pressed for an answer that would only be a mood by morning if said too quickly. On deck, the instruments are wound down with the same care that wound them up, cables laid in arcs that read like calligraphy by hands that have learned the pressure of good days and the forgiveness of days that asked for adjustments instead of captures. Memory cards travel to cases, cases travel to lockers, and each locker holds a small ledger with numbers and times and notes in writing plain enough that fatigue cannot misread meaning 6 months from now when the analysis resumes in a bright lab with a window and a fern. Cores that hold the shelf's breath in cross-section rest in their split halves, capped and taped and labeled as if their names were delicate, their story stabilized with a whisper of preservative and a promise that their next readers will be strangers with clean questions, not champions with hungry ones. Tiny bags with tiny fragments sit nested like dolls, ash that may be a letter from a mountain far away, coral that may be a clock with a single hand, grains that may have seen their last daylight at a moment when the coastline practiced being a different shape, all of it packed with the choreography of trust and a note that says where each bit will travel and when it will return. On shore, the plan is as slow as ever and just as strong. Data will be cleaned in the manner that tells the truth about correction, no exile of outliers without testimony, no filters without a footnote that explains the why and the how, no color map that cannot be redrawn by a peer with the raw files and a weekend. Reports will be written twice, once for the journals that ask for tables with lines as steady as horizons and once for letters that travel to local communities in language that does not use mystery as a disguise for condescension. A small traveling display will be built, the ridge shown as a blue sculpture, the hill as a felt map, a slice of core encased beside a gentle label that does not mistake the thing for the story, and it will make a quiet tour of a school and a town office and a library where the smell of paper still runs the show. The institutions that lent permits will see their logos where they belong, beside names that will be easy to pronounce for children who grew up watching the monsoon from porches, and the samples that left will come back as promised, wrapped in the news of what they told in a room a hemisphere away without forgetting where the room's floorboards came from. Between the last ping and the first paper, the debate will gather again, and it will do what it knows how to do, because cultures survive by repeating their strengths. Some will ask for more context beneath the age of a single charcoal fleck, and they will be right to ask. Some will ask whether a flat plane can be dressed by hand at scale in a world that still believed the plane would be dry, and they will be right to ask. Some will ask to see two lines in parallel long enough to confidently call them a wall rather than a favor paid by cooled rock to the human appetite for rectangles, and they will be right to ask. Others will pass along clips of a screen with a caption that pretends to be a conclusion, and the best response will not be scorn but the same invitation repeated with calm. Here are the files, here is the code, here is the address, come and see if the line holds under your eyes the way it held under ours when the water was green and the tide was kind. Those who favor the romance will not be punished for wanting it, but the romance will be asked to earn its stay. Those who favor caution will not be praised for delay itself, but caution will be thanked for being the last defense against a story too eager to solidify. The hill inland will keep its terraces lit by angles of morning and evening that make sense to feet and to lenses, and it will go on teaching the difference between a surface held by intention and a surface held by happenstance. Visitors will climb in silence if the wind asks for it, or in murmurs if the day asks for stories, and the basalt will remember all of them with the same equanimity it gives to rain. A stone that was not cut will be touched as if it had been, and a stone that was cut will be touched as if it were new, and in that double courtesy lies the ethic that has made the sea work. Treat every edge as an edge that matters until proven otherwise. The ridge out at sea will not change its profile because an argument sharpened, or softened, in rooms with screens. It will wait under its burden of life and its dusting of sand, and it will go on being the patient archivist's favorite shelf, whether its line once carried people or only carried the plans of the earth. There will be returns to this place because good work asks for repetition. A different month will bring different water. A different angle will bring a corner's honesty into a less ambiguous light. A different instrument, borrowed from a colleague 2 ports away, will hear a reflector that our ears missed because our sweeps were tuned for another thickness. A bad week will erase targets in silt and rewrite them on the next fair day, and the log will thank the weather for reminding everyone that persistence cannot be replaced by proficiency. The team will change by a few names, more hands learning how to fly slow and how to say a straight line is not a promise, it is only a beginning. Someone will laugh at a joke told on the first cruise and it will be new to them, and in that simple happiness lies the reason to keep the project large enough to include new minds. The field is not a contest of desserts but a kitchen where the recipes improve because fresh palates are invited to say when a taste is too strong. Elsewhere, the shelf spreads beyond this ridge into plains that also deserve a lens and a hand. Drowned river mouths hold fans that were once a day's walk from villages that no longer have names, and they may keep artifacts of passage the way a coat keeps the smell of a campfire long after the fire has cooled. Estuaries that became bays hold layers that can teach sea level's handwriting in a region where the script is regional, not global, and those layers will make the calendars for this basin more precise than a curve that averaged the world into a single line. The film will leave hints and addresses for teams who prefer other corridors east of here where the water's language is different, north where the shelf broadens until it feels like an inland sea, south where the drop-off is a sentence without commas. The hope will not be that more people share an opinion, but that more people share a habit, a way of moving through a mystery while leaving room for it to remain larger than a headline. In quieter hours, the story will return to what made it possible to sleep through, the cadence of a voice that refused to hurry a thought, the low harmony that refused to claim an emotion it did not earn, the edits that refused to push the eyes across a room faster than the breath could keep up. These choices were not decorations but an ethical way of showing that rigor can be kind, that method can be a gift rather than a gate, that attention is the architecture that people can share even when their conclusions do not match yet. If the film has done its job, the memory it leaves behind will not be a single image of a corner underwater or a number in a caption. It will be the feeling of confidence that came from watching careful hands treat the sea like a partner, not a quarry, and careful words treat doubt like a friend, not a foil. There is a moment at the end of any night on a ship when everyone who is awake becomes a student of the same small theater. The horizon brightens by imperceptible increments, and the stars do not fade so much as they are walked off stage by a light polite enough not to arrive as a shout. In that theater, the ridge below is a thought held in common. Some imagine a staircase that once saw fires in the near distance, an offering set on a level plane for reasons as mysterious and ordinary as any village's reasons. Some imagine a plane that was never more than cooling rock agreeing with gravity and later with a wave, geometry without a witness until now. The deck holds both imaginations without picking a favorite, and the ship's wake writes brackets on the surface that do not close, because the conclusion is not a punctuation mark but a promise that the sentence will be continued in a way that respects its grammar. The word that has been either a lure or a concern pyramid has done its work. It made attention show up, and it made caution show up, and it reminded everyone that words carry histories longer than films do. The work that follows trades that word for others until only the components of the claim remain: terrace, ridge, reflector, laher, ash, coral, grain, level, angle, distance, context. These words are the vocabulary of mornings, not of midnight headlines, and they are old enough to carry the weight of the shelf without bending. If a shape underwater deserves a name that will live in books, it will inherit that name the way a child inherits a suit, measured carefully, tailored by those who know how fabric falls across moving shoulders, adjusted as the seasons pass, sturdy enough to be worn without self-consciousness. If it does not, the shelf will keep its own clothes, and the film will be content to have held the hanger while the fitting happened. At the end of the end, there is not much left to do but to set the last images and sounds into a place where they will serve rather than insist. The charts roll themselves into a patient tube. The multibeam's last pass lies beside its first and looks like a deeper breath of the same inhalation. The side-scan mosaic glows like a rug in a quiet room. The sub-bottom's stacked lines look like a piece of music written for a bass instrument that only wails here completely. A slow camera holds the surface where the wake dissolves into the morning, and the voice that spoke the work into a room of sleepers lowers itself 1 degree further to say thank you in ways that are not words. The thank you is in the time taken, in the decisions not to title things with certainty that has not been earned, in the absence of rush, in the presence of small facts allowed to sit without being turned into banners. The hill and the sea will remain partners in this story regardless of how the claim fares in journals. One is the memory of fire and the habit of arranging what cools on slopes into levels that the sun understands. The other is the habit of keeping what is not needed for weather and is needed for time. Between them, people passed and will pass again, carrying instruments and ideas and coffee and stories and the unavoidable human desire to find themselves at the center of a map. The film's last quiet refusal is to let anyone stay at that center. The center belongs to the corridor itself, the ridge, the range, the shelf, the drowned plain, the laher beds, the ash lines, the manuals written by reefs for growth and by dunes for stillness, the long agreement between a stone waiting and a tide that has all the time in the world and uses it carefully. Somewhere far off, a fisherman will rub sleep from eyes and check a net and look at the color of the water and decide without words whether today is for the inside or the channel. An office light will come on in a building where the elevator carries someone to a room where code will be run that turns pings into maps with a precision that would have counted as wizardry to anyone 30 years ago. A lab will look at a shard of glass under a scope and say, quietly to the notebook, that its chemistry speaks to an eruption known by another name in another place, and a bracket in a core will get a thin, honest line. A child will be told at breakfast that a film last night showed the sea like a book that can be read if time is brought to it, and perhaps that child will ask a question that no one at the table can answer. The sea will not be in a hurry to answer either, and that is as it should be. If the ridge keeps a stare beneath green water, patience will let it rise without lifting it. If the ridge keeps only geology's generous, persuasive order, patience will let that be enough. The hope that remains at the end is not that a particular story will be crowned, but that a particular manner will be kept, the manner that makes returning to the hill and the shelf a pleasure rather than a compulsion, the manner that makes sharing the labor and the spoils a reflex rather than an afterthought, the manner that makes going slow feel like an accomplishment rather than a delay. The sleep that follows such a manner is the kind that leaves the body ready and the mind unafraid of not knowing for a while. As the final frames move from the ridge's imagined line to the blank book of the sky just before the first color appears, the sound fades to the ship's own hum, as if the hull were whispering to the water something kind, and that hum becomes softer still until it is only the memory of motion. No closing chord arrives to announce a victory that belongs to another genre. No new question arrives to pull the listener back from the edge of rest. The film leaves the room the way a diver leaves a site worth visiting again, slowly, with one look over the shoulder to fix the way back in a mind that prefers circles to lines. Then the picture quiets to almost nothing, and the last thought left behind is the simplest one the night can hold, that the sea is an honest place to ask hard things if the asking is done with the patience of stone, the precision of instruments held by hands that remember why hands were needed in the first place, and the humility to let a good question sleep when morning arrives.